It was an ancient and well-known story about Romeo and Juliet, whose names will forever remain in the memory of mankind as a symbol of a tragic love that cannot be forgotten. A young girl stood leaning on the railing looking into the distance with hope, and next to her stood a young man hiding his face behind a mask, not taking his eyes off her delicate figure, as if trying to understand her soul. The Capulet family was known for its strict discipline and unforgiving attitude towards its enemies, raising in its descendants endless determination and pride, instilling in them a sense of duty and loyalty to their traditions, which was passed down from generation to generation. And their main enemy, with whom they waged an endless and fierce struggle for influence and respect, was the Montagues family, with whom relations were always tense, full of mutual hostility and relentless competition for power and prestige in the city. At the end of this whole terrible story, a tragic moment occurred when the beloved died from a sword strike. Her life was cruelly cut short, leaving behind only deep sadness and emptiness that could not be escaped. Blue eyes full of shock and despair opened wide as if trying to come out of a painful dream, while cold sweat ran down her face, leaving visible marks on her skin as if this was not just a dream, but a terrible reality. The girl, overcome with anxiety and fear, sat up in bed breathing heavily, her chest rising with each breath, trying to escape the shackles of the nightmare that continued to torment her soul, not allowing her to forget the horrors of what she had experienced. The beauty, with slight surprise, said that it was time for her to get ready for work, but suddenly she abruptly covered her mouth with her hands, unable to believe that the voice coming from her lips did not belong to her at all, as if someone else was speaking her words. Her hands, which she saw in front of her, seemed alien, as if they were not her body, and at that moment she felt a strange alienation, as if she was not controlling her own movements but someone invisible was holding her under control. Casting a confused glance into the mirror, she realized that her soul had somehow miraculously moved into the body of a completely different person, and in front of her stood the one who had now become her reflection, so different from what she was used to seeing before. The lady sighed and remembered how before going to bed she had read a book about Romeo and Juliet, whose tragic story had no happy ending. Before closing her eyes, she whispered that she could change the ending and make it happier. Listening to the voice in her head, she was shocked to hear an unknown force state that only by reaching a worthy end to her story would she be able to return to her home world, leaving all doubts behind. Going into her garden, the girl dressed herself in exquisite, noble clothes and decided to find the lover from the book, hoping that she could make him fall in love with her, as in the mysterious story she had just read. Two young men, completely oblivious to the strangers, stood in the shadows, their lips meeting in a passionate kiss, as if the whole world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in this moment of tenderness and mad passion. The surprised boy turned around abruptly, hearing the footsteps of another person who had disturbed their peace. The man who appeared in front of him was attractive-looking with blonde hair, an earring in his ear, and eyes as blue as a clear summer sky. At this time, Juliet, completely stunned, froze in place, not expecting that Romeo, whom she considered her ideal in fact, turned out to be a carefree womanizer, and this changed her perception of everything that happened between them. The girl lay unconscious on the hard asphalt, and blood was already spreading underneath her because she had been hit by a car, and every moment was critical to get her medical help and save her life. Looking at the book that she always took with her, the girl thought about how much she would like to continue living, to enjoy every moment again, and reread her favorite novel, experiencing the same emotions that once warmed her heart. Reaching out to an old book with yellowed pages, the woman with trepidation in her soul turned to fate as if begging it to grant her another chance to fix everything, read the forgotten lines and feel the taste of life again. And suddenly, unexpectedly, from the old tattered pages soaked with time, a bright light poured into the room, filling it with a blinding glow, as if it were a miracle that came out of nowhere to change the course of events and give hope. The maid ran quickly into the mistress's chambers, breaking the silence with a sharp and loud scream that echoed off the high walls. Her voice was filled with alarm and panic, as if something inexplicable and truly terrible had happened in the house. Juliet sat on her soft bed with its lace canopy, staring at her hands, unable to believe that somehow she had been transported into the world of her favorite novel, where everything seemed so familiar. Smiling affectionately, the nanny approached her charge tenderly, as if she were a daughter, and in a soft but insistent voice reminded her that it was time to get up, start getting dressed, and get ready for a new day that promised to be full of new meetings, events, and discoveries. The noblewoman stood before a large carved mirror, with a slight smile on her lips, carefully examining her new blue dress, decorated with fine lace and gold threads, admiring how beautifully it emphasized her refined figure. Juliet froze in complete shock when she learned that Romeo, the very one she had read about with trepidation in her favorite novel, would also be at the market today, and the thought that their destinies would be tragically intertwined did not give her any peace. The lines from the book where their love story ended in death were still ringing in her head, and her heart sank painfully realizing that her feelings for the guy could lead to the same tragedy that she once reread with tears in her eyes. Clenching her fingers on her knees to calm the trembling, Juliet looked at her nanny, and with genuine curiosity bordering on determination, asked where the market was, clearly hinting at her desire to go there and perhaps meet Romeo. The weather outside was beautiful. The bright sun flooded the city with warm light, gently playing on the leaves of the trees, whose crowns leaned over the roofs of old houses, making the morning almost magical, as if time itself had slowed down. In her search for the local market, Juliet walked through the streets of the city, looking around in confusion, until she accidentally bumped into another person whose sudden look of surprise made her feel both embarrassed and interested at the same time. Frightened and stunned, Juliet quickly apologized to the pair of lovers whom she had accidentally disturbed with her sudden appearance, and feeling a hot blush creeping up her cheeks, she turned and ran away quickly, trying not to look back. She unwittingly became a witness to a touching scene where a young maiden with bitter tears in her eyes begged her lover to stay close and not leave her, but in response received only a cold look full of doubt and indecision. Juliet, barely containing her excitement, clutched the hem of her dress with her fingers trying to comprehend what she had heard. Romeo, who in the book seemed to be the embodiment of ideal love, in fact turned out to be a ladies' man, capable of giving his heart not to one, but to many at once. Suddenly, a woman's shrill cry rang out over the noisy market, pointing with a trembling finger, loudly declaring that the girl had a knife in her hands, and now the crowd began to turn around, looking incredulously in the direction of the lady, as if suspecting evil intentions. A crowd immediately gathered around the victim, and people began to discuss the tragic event with concern, remembering with horror how poor and unfortunate Mr. Romeo had been, and wondering why fate had once again treated him so cruelly. On the ground like a broken hero lay the handsome man, his face pale and his clothes stained with blood from the blow that had struck his stomach, causing many present to fear for his life and wonder about the consequences. Juliet watched with trepidation in her soul as fear gripped her from within. The thought that if Romeo died, her dream of a happy ending would crumble to dust, and she would never be able to return to her world deprived her of all hope. Without thinking for another second, she rushed forward trying to help the handsome man lying on the ground. Her heart was beating like crazy, and her mind was urging her on, suggesting that perhaps this was her last chance to change something in this story. But suddenly, as if from nowhere, racing horses appeared in front of Juliet, whose power and speed left her no chance of salvation. The coachman, desperately trying to stop them, could not cope, and a scream saturated with fear and doom was stuck in the girl's throat. The lady had suffered a terrible fate, but suddenly, as if by some invisible miracle, she woke up again in her bed. Her body was trembling and her thoughts were confused. She could not understand whether it was just a frightening dream or a terrible reality that had left a trace in her mind. As before, her kind nurse entered the chamber to help her change her clothes and begin the day. She brought with her news of the events in the market as if to distract her from the disturbing thoughts that seemed to have taken possession of her whole being. But suddenly, the lady's gaze stopped on her own shoulder, where a thin but noticeable scar was visible. This unexpected sign made her go cold, and fear stirred in her heart. If it was just a dream, then where did this strange mark come from? With a slight but nervous smile, the beautiful girl decided to ask the nanny if there had been a fight at the market yesterday, trying to hide her inner excitement and not reveal the fear that deep down inside her was tormented by the fate of Romeo. The nurse confirmed with a sad sigh. Yes, a fight had indeed taken place, and in the course of it Mr. Romeo had once again found himself in danger. The realization that he could have died again, as in the tragic story of the book, made the lady's heart beat even faster. Juliet made a vow to herself that she would make every effort to protect the life of her lover, because for her there was nothing more important than their future together full of happiness and love, and she was ready to make any sacrifice to preserve their destiny. Confident in her feelings, she was convinced that if she did everything possible to prove her devotion and love, Romeo would certainly see in her the one with whom he would want to spend his whole life, becoming an inseparable part of her world. Juliet dreamed of the moment when their hands would intertwine in a single burst of love and tenderness, symbolizing the beginning of a new chapter in their destiny, where there is no place for separation and suffering, but only bright feelings and unchanging happiness. But fate was cruel again. Juliet did not have time to save Romeo, and when he died before her eyes, she felt something inside her break. As if tied to his fate, she too left this world, dissolving in pain and despair. And once again she woke up in her bed, her breathing ragged, and new scars had appeared on her body, now visible on her back, like marks left by fate to remind her of every failed chance to change this tragic story. Each new attempt to save her beloved ended in failure, despite all her determination and willingness to take risks, and with each failure the girl's soul was penetrated deeper and deeper, forcing her to feel how with each new disappointment, her heart and body were filled with pain, and the wounds on them became more and more noticeable and impossible to heal. The world around her was literally collapsing, as were the events she found herself in. Romeo kept dying, sometimes from poison, sometimes from an axe blow, as if the whole world was against his love, and there was no escape. The desperate lady sat on the bed, her legs tucked under her, consumed by depression and unbearable sadness that seemed to envelop her, consuming her thoughts and causing her to get lost in the emptiness of her own feelings. Her empty gaze was directed into nowhere, and detachedly, as if in a dream, she spoke words addressed to an invisible interlocutor, trying to remember her name, but her memory failed her, hiding important details from her life. At this time on the street, a guy standing alone sadly muttered words full of pain, complaining that he could not save his beloved from imminent death in which he was powerless. The man held his beloved's body carefully, barely holding back his tears, feeling how her body remained motionless and there was no breathing, as if her life had been taken away forever, leaving him in the abyss of despair. The guy was not only handsome, but also had a special charm. His red eyes and dark hair gave him a mysterious look, and his delicate facial features emphasized his sophistication and inner strength hidden behind his appearance. There was relative harmony in the city, but the feud between two powerful families was destroying this fragile peace, and the feud hung over everything, like a shadow disturbing the peace and threatening to destroy the stability that the inhabitants so valued. The Capulet family was like a mighty tiger, symbolizing power, strength, and dominance. They stood proudly guarding their heritage, and every step they took felt like a confident assertion of their right to rule this world. The Montagues family was like an invisible bug, sucking up money and influencing the economy. Their hidden power was evident in the way they manipulated resources, creating an atmosphere of genuine mystery around themselves. The boy trained hard like a dummy, standing alone, holding a sword in his hand, pointing forward. His movements were precise and confident, as if every action he took was thought out in advance, and he was ready for any challenge. The eldest son of the Capulet family was called Tybalt. He was a knight, and like all his relatives, he believed that the cause of all the suffering in the world was the Montagues family, always hostile to his clan, sowing discord around. Suddenly, when the guy was about to leave, he was stopped by a familiar voice and an outstretched hand, as if warning him of danger, and a look full of alertness made him freeze in place, ready for an unexpected turn of events. Tybalt did not have time to restrain his impulsive gesture, and colliding with the girl, he unexpectedly knocked her down, but caught her in time, holding her in his arms, and with anxious words, warned her to be more careful in the future, not allowing her to fall. It was his young little cousin, whose name was Juliet, and her presence in his life was always like a ray of light in the shadows. Her innocent look and weightless smile gave him peace even in the darkest moments. Tybalt looked at his relative with a smile, because she was the favorite in their family, and her serenity and kindness were what made her special for every member of the family, especially for the young guy who was always proud of the young maiden. Lord Capulet had sworn to protect his sweet daughter since she was born, for she was his pride and joy. He loved her to tears, and her well-being was more important to him than anything else, even if it required sacrifice. And so the man took the young boy into his family and entrusted him with the task of looking after his daughter, realizing that in this world she needed a protector who would give everything for her safety and well-being. Thus, Juliet found a strong ally who became a reliable support for her. His name was Tybalt, and he readily accepted the responsibility for her protection, vowing to be there in any situation. The little girl, squealing joyfully, grabbed her protector's finger, glowing with happiness, as if not realizing the importance of his role in her life. But her trust and purity of feelings filled his heart with pride. With a blush on his face, the boy smiled, ready to provide protection and take responsibility for his younger cousin, guarding her and helping her in everything she could possibly want. He constantly followed his cousin, never leaving her alone, and she in turn got into the most amusing and awkward situations, such as once when she climbed a tall tree and could not get down, requiring help. One day when the girl, all grown up, came to him covered in flowers, telling him that they had been given to her, Tybalt was shocked. He could not believe how quickly she had grown up and how her innocence had been replaced by femininity, which shook him to the core. And so when the little girl turned into a beautiful young girl, more and more guys began to show attention to her, give her flowers, and even read poems expressing their admiration for her insane beauty, which only caused him anxiety. Tybalt shuddered in horror when he heard that one of the youths was ready to take his cousin by force to kidnap her if she did not agree to be his. He realized that his role as protector had become more important than ever, and now he was ready to fight for her safety. The cousin felt like a man who was guarding a poor and innocent lamb, protecting it from bloodthirsty wolves ready to harm it, because it was his duty to protect it from any threat and fear, like a faithful guard. All he really wanted was to see Juliet happy, for her laughter to always sound, and for her smile to light up the world around her, bringing light and joy like the spring sun that warms the heart. When Juliet was happy, her bright smile made Tybalt himself unable to restrain himself from joyful laughter and smiles, and they often walked in the garden, enjoying every moment of her carefree gaiety. However, something was bothering him, and now, for the third time, he went to the market where the crowd was loudly discussing the news that the Montagues family had again entered into a fight with Capulet, filling his soul with anxiety. Tybalt was a renowned swordsman in his country, and everyone feared him, for it could happen that any of his opponents would be nothing more than meat on the tip of his sword, falling victim to his inexorable strength and skill. Since childhood, he did not like the Montagues because they often made fun of him, laughed without being embarrassed by their actions, and this left deep grievances in his soul that could not pass without a trace forming hatred. The Montagues were always impudent people, not ashamed of their actions or their words, ready to commit any meanness for their own benefit, without thinking about the consequences, which only increased the hostility and enmity with Capulet. Raising his weapon, the man exclaimed with fury in his voice that if the Montagues had insulted ordinary citizens, who in turn were relatives of the Capulets, then the barbarians had insulted an entire family, and such criminals deserved punishment. People greeted the hero with joy and gratitude because he was ready to protect them from the evil and merciless Montagues, ready to cause pain and destruction, and they believed that with him their life would become safer. At the end of a long day, the boy, feeling tired and exhausted, finally lay down on his bed, closing his eyes and feeling his whole body fill with heaviness because he gave all his energy to the fight. In his dream, his beloved cousin appeared to him with long black hair braided into a hairstyle and in a cute dress that perfectly emphasized her grace, and he could not help but admire her beauty and tenderness. Sweet Juliet smiled at him, her eyes were shining with happiness, and she looked at him with such sincere joy that the guy's heart was filled with warmth, feeling the fullness of her love and feelings. In this dream, she seemed to see her love, her destiny, and both of them so close to each other were filled with happiness, and their joy seemed so bright and unchanging that this moment remained in his memory forever. However, everything ended tragically, and the blade covered in blood became evidence of an inevitable fate, reminding us that nothing lasts forever, and sometimes the most beautiful dreams are destined to fade away. Juliet, overcome with deep pain and despair without hesitation, plunged the dagger into her heart, and her life was tragically cut short, leaving behind only emptiness and immeasurable sorrow. The boy woke up with a sudden movement, jumping up in his bed, and in a panic began to ask himself why his beloved cousin, with whom he had shared the best moments, was doomed to such a terrible fate even in a dream. Next to the lady on the bed lay a young man with bleached hair, and his lifeless body also evoked a sense of tragedy, because he looked no less dead than she did, as if the light had gone from his eyes, leaving only emptiness. This guy was a real womanizer whose reputation left no chance for Juliet to fall in love with him, especially since she was not ready to sacrifice herself for such a man whose actions spoke of his emptiness. A bead of sweat trickled down the man's face as his thoughts ran through the possible consequences, and he realized that perhaps this was a prediction of the future, vague and inevitable, that he could not ignore. Looking out the window at the moon and sitting in bed, Tybalt realized that he had to do everything he could to protect his cousin, because her safety was the most important thing to him, and he could not afford to lose. The lady joyfully called out her relative's name, and like an angel, she literally fell from the sky, her body tumbling rapidly until it met the hands of someone who could catch her. Tybalt, instantly catching the lady, reproached her with a slight smile, reminding her that such actions could be extremely dangerous and that she should not risk her life so carelessly, because he would always be there to support her. The beauty, continuing to speak in a sweet and confident voice, admitted that she knew that this guy would always have time to catch her, but suddenly her voice became trembling, and with a question on her lips, she asked why he did not save her last time. The dream, which seemed calm and peaceful, suddenly turned into a real nightmare when the man's face distorted into an expression of incomprehension, and a drop of blood fell from his face to the ground, with which an unknown tragedy was associated. Juliet, like a lifeless doll, began to fall from the arms of the panicking youth, and her body again lay on the ground, deprived of life, and at that moment she seemed to be resurrected and died again in his arms. Only the knife with its bloody steel continued to slide along the river of blood, leaving behind a trail of what was left of the battle, as a reminder of the pain and death that overshadowed the mind and heart in that moment. The sounds of fighting could be heard on the training field, not far from which stood a house. Its walls seemed gloomy and seemed to absorb all the sounds of this battle, leaving only silence around. Tybalt stood there, tired, with dark circles under his eyes, looking like a zombie who hadn't had enough sleep from the nightmare that had haunted him the night before, and he couldn't shake the heavy feeling of fatigue that seemed to be weighing him down. The cousin tilted his head to the side, not wanting to admit it to himself, but realizing that Juliet could possibly actually fall in love with a jerk like Romeo, and it tormented him because he knew her feelings were sincere. Handsome Montagues was the ideal young man with whom all the girls of their country fell in love, like a prince spoiled on the throne, surrounded by attention, who could easily conquer hearts, but in his eyes there was emptiness, unable to give true love. But behind the mask of this handsome man lurked a snake whose words were worthless, for he used them to manipulate, creating the illusion of sincerity, while in his soul there was no room for either feelings or honesty. Tybalt decided for himself that he should keep his cousin away from this womanizer, because he knew very well that Juliet would not find happiness with this man, but only disappointment and pain, which he did not want to cause her. The women greeted Romeo with delight, meeting him with rosy faces and shining smiles that were full of admiration and adoration, as if he were their ideal with whom they were ready to share any moment of their lives. The guy tried to move forward, pushing his way past the girls who were in love with him, and with a politeness that was almost tired of their attention, he asked them to give him the way, although they still couldn't take their eyes off his attractiveness. The young man with golden hair was incredibly charming, and his faithful friend walked next to him, and Romeo, with a smile, greeted the ladies and gently asked them not to interfere with his walk, as if these words were natural and effortless for him. Montagues suddenly smiled seductively. His gaze became bold, his beauty incredible, and he began to flirt with the ladies, causing in their eyes a desire that they tried with difficulty to hide from his attention. Tybalt watched the womanizer with complete indifference, but irritation was boiling in his soul. He was infuriated by the behavior of his interlocutor, as if he was trying to provoke anger in him, and he was ready to express his dissatisfaction. He then called Romeo a coward who failed to intervene in the servants' fight when it was necessary to separate them, but instead chose to stand aside as if indifferent and unable to influence what was happening. The handsome man bowed his head and with a slight sigh said that he should have known in advance that Tybalt would say such words, because he was a boor unable to appreciate the seriousness of the situation, preferring only criticism. Romeo smiled mockingly and added that he was not one to interfere in other people's affairs, unlike his interlocutor, who always sought to interfere in personal squabbles, as if it was important to him that everything happened according to his will. Tybalt shuddered with indignation, his chest filled with anger, and his eyes flashed with fury, for such insolent words spoken with such contempt literally insulted him and made him feel that he had been humiliated by this attack. Playing the victim, Romeo, without batting an eyelid, said that a man by interfering in other people's affairs takes away from families the opportunity to sort things out and forgive each other, as if he knew how to properly resolve all issues, neglecting other people's feelings. Tybalt did not fall for the womanizer's trick, and without hiding his contempt, threw his sword straight in his direction, challenging him to a fight, intending to show that the words of this handsome lady's man could not overshadow his determination and courage, and that he was ready to answer for his dignity. The sharp blade of the sword in his hand, tightly clenched as if ready to cut through any obstacle, felt like an extension of his rage, and Tybalt was ready to make him understand with one decisive movement that manipulations would not remain without consequences, and everything he said would be paid for. With a serious face, Capulet, not hiding his determination, invited the Montagues to fight, proposing that their blades should decide which of them was right and who had the right to speak of honor standing his ground. Everything was clear. To be afraid was to be weak. Romeo, feeling awkward and obviously scared, fell silent, his eyes darting around in search of excuses because he wasn't ready to fight anyone, and there was much more fear than determination, his inner voice screaming that this was not his path. His friend standing next to him looked at him with a cold gaze, as if conveying a silent message that if Romeo refused the fight, he would bring shame not only to himself but also to his entire family, because a real man never backs down from a challenge. Romeo winced, gritting his teeth. His inner resistance was strong, but he knew that he had no choice but to accept the challenge, because to refuse a fight would mean betraying not only himself but also his honor, and he could not allow that. Suddenly the womanizer turned to his rival and, smiling broadly, did it so strangely as if he had some hidden plan that he was preparing to reveal at the most unexpected moment, as if his whole plan was hidden in this smile. The blade fell to the ground with a clatter as Romeo, no longer able to hide his weakness, explained that times were changing, and there was no point in fighting anymore, as words and reason were more important now than the strength of the blade that lay at his feet. Tybalt took a step back as the handsome man approached him, realizing that they were not barbarians, and therefore they should act like true lords of noble families, observing etiquette and rules that were best demonstrated in the refined duels. As a result, the swordsman was exposed as a rude and scoundrel, and nasty rumors began to circulate among the crowd that he was the adopted son of a lord, which made him look more like a pathetic imitator than a true nobleman, and his reputation went downhill. Young Tybalt was outraged. He could hardly contain his indignation when he heard his interlocutor say that it was time for them to go to a fencing lesson, and he realized that he would again decide to avoid fighting him, preferring study and training to an honest fight. The trees rustled, the wind blew, and silence surrounded everything around, broken only by the slight movement of the leaves, and everything else was absorbed by silent nature, as if it itself knew that something important was happening, but did not interfere. The man, confused and dissatisfied, walked forward along the road, absorbed in thoughts about what he should do now, how to correct his honor, and what could be done with this situation in which he found himself having neither support nor a clear path. Suddenly, Tybalt heard someone else talking. Somewhere off to the side, a man named Benvolio was loudly scolding Romeo for once again avoiding a duel and behaving like a coward, evading a dispute that should have been decided by his honor. Romeo, disgruntled and insulted, stood to the side, frowning, his face contorted with irritation, as he listened to his behavior being criticized for its unworthy attitude, since it was not his nature as the heir of the Montagues to avoid battles and show weakness. The young man, heated with anger and resentment, unable to bear such humiliation, turned sharply and walked away, not wanting to listen any longer to his mentor, whose words only added fire to his rage instead of supporting and teaching. Tybalt, having overheard someone else's conversation, realized that other people had their own reasons for arguing, and that not everything was as simple and smooth in their relationship as it seemed to him. The moment made him think that behind every situation, there is not only personal pride but also hidden motives. At that moment, Cousin Capulet calmed down, realizing that Juliet could hardly ever fall in love with such a jerk as Romeo, realizing that her feelings were perhaps deeper and more complex than he could have guessed at first glance. However, Tybalt suddenly noticed that he and the guy continued to walk along the same road, did not part and could not separate in any way, as if some invisible force had tied them to this path, not realizing that all this time they had been following the same direction. The young man put his hand on his neck and scratched it, thinking that if he had chosen a different path, he would have arrived home only at sunset, realizing that time had passed, and he still had not decided what to do with this protracted and absurd confrontation. Suddenly, the handsome man noticed that someone was sitting and reading a book behind the trees, and his gaze lingered on this person as if something in this moment caught his attention, as if this person held the answer to all his doubts. It was sweet Juliet, spending her time reading her beauty, flawless as always, her face reflecting peace, and the silence around her only increased her charm. She was sitting on the grass, absorbed in a book, and seemed completely carefree. The nightmare where the lady died came back to him, and the thought took Romeo by surprise again. Tybalt felt his heart beat faster, and his hands instinctively reached up to his face as if trying to push away the horrible image that haunted him. With determination and cold confidence, Tybalt firmly decided that he would not allow the womanizer to meet his cousin, because he knew that with Romeo she could only expect pain, and he could not allow her to suffer for the sake of some frivolous young man. The noblewoman sitting near the tree turned around peacefully when she heard the strange sound. Her attention was instantly drawn to the unusual silence. Something in the air changed, and she felt her instincts become alert. Tybalt was breathing heavily. Sweat was running down his face, and he hoped that the girl hadn't heard anything. His nerves were on edge, and every rustle made him wary, as if something was bound to happen. Meanwhile, Romeo found himself in the arms of his companion, whose hands covered his mouth, preventing him from saying a word, as if Romeo himself were part of this hidden conflict into which he had been drawn against his will. Tybalt angrily ordered the young man next to him to be quiet and not draw attention to himself, realizing that any action he took could lead to their secret being revealed, and he could not allow this to happen despite all his anger. Finally, Juliet finished reading, carefully closing the cover of the book with her hands, and with a loud thud the book closed, leaving her in complete silence, as if nature itself had stopped waiting for what would happen next. The noble beauty stood up, deciding to go home, wondering whether dinner was ready yet, because her thoughts were absorbed in everyday concerns, as if not noticing all the hidden threats that were in the air around her. The boy breathed a sigh of relief when his cousin finally left unharmed, and he, hiding his emotions, felt an easy victory, knowing that he had prevented a possible disaster, but inside he still remained tense, waiting for new turns of events. After which, Tybalt finally released Romeo from his grip, asking for his forgiveness, and justifying himself by saying that he simply saw a bear, and therefore it was necessary to be quieter despite all the tension and confrontation that had arisen between them. However, as soon as Romeo took a few steps, he suddenly began to fall unconscious, which frightened Tybalt. He was stunned, as if the young man had passed out from lack of oxygen and could not understand what happened at that moment. The real Capulet, confused, began to shake the local womanizer to bring him to his senses, trying to bring him to consciousness, because he did not know what to do if Romeo really lost consciousness or something more serious happened. The man, shuddering with horror, realized that he could accidentally kill the heir of the Montagues. A great panic seized his heart, and he tried in confusion to find a way out of this situation, realizing that any of his actions could have unpredictable consequences. Romeo collapsed to the ground, his body motionless without the slightest sign of life, as if nature itself was frozen in sadness watching this tragic scene, where it seemed that even time had stopped its course to capture the moment. Tybalt, bending down next to the lying youth, carefully put his ear to his chest, hoping to hear at least a weak heartbeat, but feeling only icy silence, shuddered with his whole body, realizing that life had left this beautiful young man forever. Capulet trembled all over, refusing to believe that his hands had committed such a terrible deed, and now he stood overcome with fear and guilt, realizing that he had forever destroyed the future of the heir of the family with which they were bound by enmity. One of the guys grabbed the other one tightly by the hand, desperately pulling him along, as if wanting to tear him away from this tragedy, and in a panic full of fear and hope, he rushed to call for help, hoping that fate would still allow them to return the lost lives. A difficult but necessary decision was made to go to church, where they believed they could seek divine help and prayers that could perhaps change the course of fate and return what was lost. The man, hoping that the priest could perform a miracle and heal Montagues, pulled his lifeless body with all his might, as if believing that the very act of loyalty and perseverance could bring about the mercy of heaven. Ultimately, Cousin Capulet faced exile for the murder of Montagues, or imprisonment, a grim prospect full of despair and bitterness that seemed inevitable once the truth of what had been done became known. The man shuddered with his whole body, realizing that his future could only turn out to be worse. Perhaps death or an inglorious existence awaited him, but the thought of punishment did not frighten him as much as the need to live without forgiveness. However, if the price for Juliet's happiness and safety meant making such sacrifices, Tybalt was ready to accept this fate without a moment's hesitation, because for the sake of her future, he could sacrifice everything he had. Suddenly, Tybalt stumbled, lost his balance, and fell to the ground with a dull thud right next to Romeo's motionless body. The man's gaze fell on the young man, whose helpless body seemed to symbolize the fragility of life, which could be so easily destroyed by one false step. The man lost consciousness, and when he came to, he felt the softness of a snow-white sheet beneath him. His gaze fell on a clenched male hand, which was nervously squeezing the fabric as if seeking support in this strange and frightening reality. The swordsman jumped up in his seat, trying to comprehend where he was, his wide, surprised eyes running over the unfamiliar surroundings, full of strange silence and majestic calm. Tybalt looked around in amazement, noticing that he was in a room furnished with exquisite luxury. Gold patterns on the furniture, brocade on the curtains, and a soft carpet under his feet created the feeling that he had been transported to another world. Pressing his hand to his stomach to calm his anxious excitement, he suddenly noticed that he was wearing completely new clothes. A snow-white nightshirt which someone had obviously carefully selected and dressed him in while he was unconscious. Suddenly, the maid burst into the room with a noise, loudly exclaiming that Tybalt had slept especially long today and spent the whole morning in bed as if he had forgotten about business and worries. Her voice sounded both alarmed and reproachful, causing the man to become wary. Tybalt looked down and thought thoughtfully about the fact that perhaps his crime had already been discovered and the decision about his punishment had been made, and therefore this whole calm atmosphere could only be a prelude to the inevitable punishment. However, the maid had something completely different in mind. She, not suspecting for a moment of his worries, put a basin of water on the table and, looking at him with surprise, asked what he was talking about in such a strange, tense voice. Tybalt froze, shocked by the news he heard from her. It turned out that Montagues had once again entered into a fight with the Capulet family's men that morning, as if nothing had happened. Shocked to the depths of his soul, he rushed to run along the long corridor, unable to understand what was happening now. Romeo, according to his memories, died in his arms, and this guilt burned his heart, and now everything seemed to return to normal, causing horror and bewilderment. Juliet greeted her cousin with a warm and sincere smile, her blue eyes filled with joy at meeting a loved one. However, the moment she looked at his face, her mood immediately darkened. Something was wrong. However, Tybalt, gloomy and lost in his own thoughts, just walked past her without even stopping, and when she tried to speak, he responded rudely and coldly, saying that he had too much to do and that he had no time for talking now. Meanwhile, the heir of the Montagues family, accompanied by guards, was escorted back to his estate, sternly informed that his punishment had already been determined. He would be held responsible for provoking the fight, jeopardizing the fragile truce. Romeo frowned and slowly looked up, and at that very moment his attention was drawn to the sudden appearance of Tybalt, who stepped out of the shadows so abruptly, as if he wanted to emphasize his importance and show that he had not appeared by chance. The young man, hardly noticing the presence of his cousin from the Capulet family, passed by him with such a defiant air that he stopped only to call him a coward, unworthy even of his servants, and sarcastically repeated Capulet's words of the previous day. Deep night had fallen, covering the world with a thick blanket of darkness. The trees stood motionless like black silhouettes in a chaotic dance, and every sound seemed louder against the absolute silence of the surrounding forest. Tybalt sat on the edge of his bed, lost in painful thoughts, and could not understand why everything turned out the way it did, because he clearly remembered how yesterday he pierced Montague's heart, and the last glimmer of life froze in his eyes. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and a voice coming from the other side said that he had brought dinner for the swordsman, hoping that it would somehow brighten up his loneliness, but it was obvious that the situation itself was not conducive to a meal. However, in response, the maiden heard that Tybalt was sitting without an appetite, absorbed in gloomy thoughts, and therefore resolutely did not let the lady into his chambers, refusing even simple gestures of attention and care. The noble woman standing in front of the door sadly explained that she was worried about her cousin, who had not left the room for too long, and was behaving strangely, as if something unknown was gnawing at his soul and depriving him of his former peace. With his hands folded in front of him in a gesture of humility, Capulet quietly asked for forgiveness, aware that even at that moment his words might not be heard, but he still hoped that he could at least slightly ease the great suffering. Tybalt, heading for the door, wanted to greet his cousin, convince her that she was not guilty, and try to calm her down, because the anxiety in his heart did not allow him to remain calm and indifferent, understanding that her experiences were not an accident. The lady entering the room seemed to become part of the dark world that surrounded Tybalt, and her green dress flowing across the floor gave the moment additional heaviness, as if slowing down time and emphasizing the tragedy of what was happening and her internal conflict. However, suddenly, the girl, unable to restrain herself, lowered the tray, and it fell to the floor with a dull sound, breaking the dishes, and the sound of breaking glass echoed throughout the room, emphasizing the destruction not only material, but also moral, because every action of hers only brought this moment of despair closer. Tybalt himself flinched as the lady instantly grabbed the blade and pressed it to his chest, her threat clear and decisive, her words filled with rage, a determination to destroy him, a willingness to fight to the last, even if it meant resorting to cruelty. The man began to shake with fear in the lady's arms, feeling her coldness and determination. His body did not give in to resistance, and there was so much harshness in her gaze that he realized that her intentions were far from peaceful, and not a single word could change her mood. The eyes of this beauty, full of icy cruelty, were cold and merciless like the gaze of a predator who knows no pity and no fear, and he felt how these eyes penetrated his soul as if freezing him from the inside. Juliet quietly said that she couldn't put the knife down and free her cousin because her internal conflict was so strong that she couldn't just back down, even if it meant continuing to threaten someone she once considered family. The lady seemed to be not herself, emotionless and detached. She thought that Tybalt was behaving strangely, although she herself was overcome by the same doubts and insecurities as he was, and her own behavior had long ceased to be the norm. Without thinking twice, the boy grabbed a long stick, intending to defend himself, and with a determination that was difficult to hide, he prepared to meet the lady's onslaught, hoping that this improvised shield would help him avoid danger. With this thing, he pushed away the lady, who frowned, stepping aside, but still continued to hold on tightly to the dagger, as if she was not going to give up despite the fact that her plan did not go as she expected. The candlestick collided with the blade, the resulting crash filling the room like an echo from the clash of two worlds. the world where she was a beautiful lady, and the world where she had become a determined and dangerous woman ready to do anything for her goals. The girl moved as if she were a hired killer. Her movements were precise and fast, completely unlike those that the sweet and innocent Juliet could make. Her self-confidence was frightening. Suddenly the candlestick was thrown towards the lady, and it flew through the air with such force that she had to dodge it, while the lad, seized with panic, shouted asking who this strange stranger was who looked so much like his cousin. The beauty dodged under the shout of the guy who asked who this strange stranger was, who looked so much like his cousin, because at that moment his mind could not believe what was happening in front of him, not realizing that all this was much more complicated than he thought. Tybalt, with despair in his voice, asked where his Juliet was, and what this strange lady was doing here who was obviously trying to kill him, and his mind could not comprehend this terrible riddle, because every gesture of hers was like a step into the abyss. A cut appeared on the beauty's cheek from the guy's blow, and blood flowed from there. Her face was distorted with pain, but she did not allow herself to give up, continuing on her way, despite the injury, as if it was just part of her plan. Juliet thoughtfully ran her fingers over her cheek and said to herself that this time everything was different. Her thoughts seemed to be torn apart by conflicting feelings, and only one thought arose in her head. Something was wrong here, and she could not understand what exactly. Suddenly, the noblewoman burst into tears, pitifully calling her cousin by name. She said that she was simply playing with her relative, and he behaved so rudely, and there was sincere resentment in her voice, as if she really did not understand why she was taken seriously. Tybalt, in shock, froze when he heard from his cousin that it was just a joke, and his mind could not immediately believe what was happening, because in front of him stood the one whom he saw as a threat, and now all his feelings were mixed up. Rubbing his neck awkwardly, the man agreed to come closer to her and examine the cut he had given her, feeling his doubts and fear subside, giving way to some strange guilt and a desire to fix everything. However, as Tybalt came closer, he was grabbed tightly by female arms, pulling him towards her, and he felt his body being captured before he could realize that all this was part of her next move, thought out in advance and carefully prepared. Juliet smiled kindly and asked her interlocutor to relax and not to tense up, but the guy became scared only from her reaction and the strange behavior of his relative, who suddenly became completely unpredictable, as if she was hiding something dangerous. And despite her soft words, he took them as a warning, because suddenly the beauty's smile was replaced by a terrible expression and a smirk. She promised to hurt him if he did not relax, and Tybalt felt the tension in his body increase. Before Tybalt could blink, he was on the floor and the lady was sitting on top of him, holding him in a grip, not letting him get up, and it was like a trap he had driven himself into before he could even realize when her gentle smile turned into a deadly threat. The boy lay on the floor with his mouth open, his face covered in sweat, and horror and fear were visible in his eyes, as if the whole world around him had suddenly become alien and hostile, and every movement of Juliet was intensified to the limit, causing his heart to beat at a furious pace. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the charming Juliet explained that he shouldn't worry and that she really needed his help because everything that was happening was part of her plan, which wasn't as simple as he thought. The cold beauty confirmed that she was not his cousin, but a completely different person with the face of his relative, and her words penetrated Tybalt's soul, leaving deep questions in his mind about who she really was. The noblewoman smiled, her face hardened, and she began to tell the truth, that she had taken over the noblewoman's body until she had fulfilled her purpose, and then she would return to her world, and only then would he be able to bring back his cousin. Standing by the window, the lady asked with genuine interest if Tybalt was going to help her, her gaze radiating confidence, as if she was convinced that the outcome of this meeting was already predetermined, and all that remained was to get the right answer from him. The guy did not immediately believe the beauty's words because everything that was happening was so strange that he did not understand what exactly was happening and therefore remained silent, not knowing what to say and how to react to what was said. But the bloody sword was proof that Juliet was not the sweet girl Tybalt knew, and his doubts gradually began to give way to horror at the realization that a completely different, dangerous entity stood before him. The girl took a step forward in understanding, and although her words sounded like nonsense, she was well aware of how strange all this might look, but everything she said was true, and she was ready to prove it. The aristocrat sat down on the bed and thoughtfully asked herself what she had to do to make the man believe her, because everything that was happening seemed so ridiculous and did not fit into the mind of Tybalt, who was not ready to accept her words. Tybalt shuddered in horror when he heard that the lady knew about what had happened yesterday about his murder of Romeo, and this knowledge deeply shocked him, for how could she have known about it unless she had witnessed or been part of what he considered impossible? The handsome man lay on the floor, lifeless. His body seemed to be consumed by the shadow of horror, as if it had eclipsed everything around him, unable to comprehend what was happening, and the world around him was falling apart from this indescribable silence. With a cold, creepy look and a grin with blood on her cheek, the beauty said that Tybalt was to blame for Romeo's death, and her words sounded like a sentence which instantly awakened a feeling of guilt and fear in him. Closing her eyes, Juliet now understood why Tybalt had been acting so strangely. He too had traveled through time, and this discovery changed her perception of the situation, as if everything that had happened was just part of a larger picture. The guy couldn't believe how much the beauty knew about him, about his fears, guilt, and experiences, and this terrible moment was a shock for him, because he didn't expect that his secrets would be revealed so quickly. The lady still joyfully and feignedly said that she was Juliet from another world, and her words continued to sound like a riddle, further confusing his mind and pushing him to the idea that this moment could not be ignored. The lady extended her hand forward and promised that she would tell him part of the truth about what was happening if he helped her, and her gesture was like a promise to reveal a world full of mysteries and secrets, in which Tybalt might have to play a key role. Tybalt was in no hurry to accept the offer before asking if the lady was sure that his cousin would return after her return to her world, because this thought did not leave him, and he could not risk it without knowing what would really happen to Juliet if she disappeared from his life. Having received consent, the nobleman shook the lady's hand, and the moment their hands met, she said that she had never lied to him, and her words sounded sincere, like a promise that she would not deceive him in the future. Suddenly, Juliet pulled her interlocutor sharply after her shouting that it was time for them to go, and her voice was filled with determination, as if time was running out, and their entire fate depended on what would happen in the next minute. The girls' chambers were pink, filled with soft light, expensive things, and comfort, and in this world everything seemed ideal, almost fabulous, but this was only the outer shell hiding more than he could have expected. Tybalt stood awkwardly at the entrance to his relative's room, unsure of how to act. He had never been in her chambers, and felt that this was impermissible, especially considering that her room was a sacred place for a girl innocent and pure. The beauty knelt down on the floor and, bending down, picked up one of the tiles under which papers and notes were hidden, and her movements were precise and quick, as if she had long been accustomed to looking for what she needed in the most unexpected places. Without thinking twice, she threw her letters into the nobleman's lap, and all these sheets were filled with the most important information that she had collected especially for him, so that he would realize how much their future depended on these notes. These notes recorded everything that could happen in the future, and each page contained the answer to the most important question that could change not only their lives, but the very course of time if they did not make the right decision. Tybalt suddenly laughed when he read on paper the awkward death of Romeo, who slipped on a tomato and died from this absurd incident, and his laughter was full of surprise at the absurdity of what was happening. However, the man immediately stopped laughing, his mouth wide open in amazement, when he realized that this ending was not the worst, because according to the records, Juliet did not marry Romeo, which seemed incredible to him. But despite this, the guy still died because of the tomato, and no matter what attempt the lady made to change this outcome, her efforts were in vain. Romeo's death was predicted, and nothing could avoid it even if she tried to save him. Eventually, the maiden explained that she had asked her cousin to help her marry Romeo and bring to life the ideal ending she had dreamed of, believing that this would lead to the right outcome for everyone in her world. The nobleman stood there, awkwardly horrified, asking if the lady had to marry this womanizer, since the idea that she could be with such a man seemed impossible to him, and he could not understand why Romeo in particular was so important. Pressing her palm to her cheek, Juliet agreed that there was a condition. Her fiancé had to be the sweet Romeo, and it was inevitable as part of her destiny, which she intended to fulfill no matter what. Now she had her own loyal swordsman Adal who would help her make her goals come true, and she was sure that with his help, everything would work out because he was the only one who could act according to her plan, without asking unnecessary questions. With the help of the map, they will be able to find their way to the right place, which will lead them to a good ending that will not only justify their efforts, but will also open the doors to a new life filled with hope and opportunities to change the future. Following the directions, they will soon find a treasure chest that will open, and a bright light will come out of it, as if fate itself had finally decided to reveal to them the secrets that had remained hidden from their eyes until now. And Tybalt joyful will return his sweet cousin back, and the long-awaited family reunion will come when their hearts will beat in unison, and all the trials and dangers will be left behind, leaving only happiness and a bright future. The man nervously shuffled through the papers on which were written down various options for how Romeo could have died, and each line added anxiety to his heart because there was not one of these outcomes that he liked. Tybalt sighed excitedly, not knowing what to do, feeling that this was not his Juliet, and everything that was happening was alien to him because he understood. In front of him there was someone else who was using the face of the girl who was dear to him. This stranger needed his help to return to her world through the mirror, and she was ready to do anything to carry out her plan, despite the fact that her goals and intentions remained dark and unclear to Tybalt. The guy's hand gripped the documents firmly and decisively, as if he was trying to take control of the situation, not to let it slip away even if everything that was happening seemed impossible, and in his soul there was a burning uncertainty that he continued to fight. He remembered how little Juliet as a child asked him to always be there on her side, because she considered him her best friend and believed that he would always be there ready to help at any moment. The boy then made a vow that he would always protect his cousin, and that promise became an integral part of his being so deep and strong that it never allowed him to forget who he was to her, no matter the difficulties of the world. The girl, feeling satisfied, smiled, hearing from the man the words that he would do everything possible to support her, confident that with his help she would definitely achieve her goal and that his participation would be decisive in her mission. Soon, however, Tybalt regretted his words as he carried Romeo on his shoulder, with a cap on his head, realizing that his decisions filled with promises could lead to the most unexpected and difficult consequences. Montagues laughed loudly, his smile stretching from ear to ear, reflecting the wild joy and sense of victory he seemed to feel, despite all the difficulties around him. His laughter was infectious, and he seemed to simply enjoy the moment without thinking about the consequences. The boys walked forward cheerfully, looking around at everything that surrounded them, and an atmosphere of celebration and victory reigned around them, as if the whole city was absorbed in this solemn mood in which there was no room for troubles and doubts. On the floor lay papers on which were written the roles that Tybalt was to play according to the lady's plan, where every detail, every step was thought out and written down with the utmost precision, as if fate had already been decided. The lady showed the guy a plan on paper which stated that the cousin was to become Romeo's friend and gain his favor in order to be used in the game she was developing to fulfill her goals. The man, shouting indignantly, declared that he could not become Montague's friend because he literally hated this womanizer with each passing day. His contempt for Romeo only grew stronger, and the thought of playing on the same side with him seemed impossible. Sitting on the bed, Juliet explained that improving relations with Montagues would help bring back his cousin, and that only with his help would it be possible to carry out the plan, since between them there would be not only an ally, but also a mutually beneficial relationship. Juliet sincerely asked her partner to try to become Romeo's friend, despite all his prejudices and hostility, because only in this way they could advance towards their goal and change the outcome of events in their favor. The next morning came and training began on dummies installed in a special yard where every blow, every movement had to be honed to perfection, because not only their fate depended on it, but also the fates of those who were dear to them. Tybalt walked forward without much enthusiasm, sadly thinking about how difficult it would be to become friends with the Montagues, especially after so many years of mutual hatred that had become a part of his life, and he didn't know where to start. Meanwhile, Romeo was smiling and chatting with the other ladies, entertaining them and showing off his charisma as usual, oblivious to the tension in the air that hung between him and Tybalt. Out of the corner of his eye, Tybalt noticed how his company with the ladies was interrupted by Capulet, who was nervously clutching his head and walking in circles nearby, clearly absorbed in some internal experiences that did not give him peace. The boy flinched when Romeo addressed him, wishing him good morning. The man's voice was full of irony and that disdain that always caused a storm of irritation in the sweet Tybalt, making him instantly wary. With a sarcastic smile, Romeo waved his hand at Tybalt, throwing a snide remark in his direction that he was a coward for failing to protect his servants last time, and there was a clear mockery in his words that only added fuel to the fire. Tybalt responded with irritation that Montagues was acting like a petulant and immature child, as if he didn't know how to deal with people he couldn't trust, especially when they couldn't show even a modicum of maturity and reason. Remembering his plan with his cousin, Tybalt took a deep breath, trying to pull himself together, and forced a fake smile on his face to hide his worries, then wished Romeo a good day without giving in to his emotions. The guys in the crowd were completely shocked to see such strange behavior of Capulet, who always responded to the handsome guy's antics with rage, anger, and aggression, but now he seemed to pretend that nothing had happened, creating a mysterious atmosphere. Romeo also noticed the unusual behavior of his interlocutor, and frowning asked with obvious bewilderment what was happening to Capulet, because he had never seen anything like this before, and his strange behavior really alarmed him. In response to Romeo's incredulous expression, Tybalt smiled politely, assuring them in a tone full of sincerity and joy that all the changes in his behavior were solely for the sake of establishing relations and truly friendly communication between them. With a forced grin, the young man looked like a real demon, despite all his efforts to act friendly, as if he was hiding something much deeper behind the smile, saying that he had long dreamed of becoming real friends with his interlocutor. The men began to hide behind Montagues, in fear, not wanting to face such a frightening grin from Capulet, and Romeo himself stood in complete horror, trying to understand what was happening and what was hidden behind this absolutely ridiculous and strange behavior. The nobleman tried to figure out whether Tybalt was really serious, whether he was making fun of him, or whether he had some secret and cunning plan that he himself did not yet realize, but deep down he suspected that all this was not just like that. Pretending nothing was happening and naively feigning innocence, Romeo asked in bewilderment if he thought they were sworn enemies, and now apparently the swordsman finally realized that the Montagues were not such bad people as he had previously thought. Putting his hand on his new friend's shoulder, the man loudly and joyfully shouted mockingly that apparently the Capulets had finally realized that they were much worse than the Montagues, because their behavior did not at all correspond to the standards of decency. Tybalt, trying to contain his inner anger, clenched his teeth, realizing that everything he was doing was for one purpose only, for Juliet. He endured humiliation and anger because he wanted to get his cousin back and fulfill her request. Suddenly, Romeo raised his interlocutor's hand high and joyfully shouted that they should all go to the market and celebrate such good news, the end of the long-standing feud between their old families. Rumors spread throughout the city that the bloody conflicts between the two famous houses had finally ended, and the long-awaited peace had arrived, which would bring prosperity to everyone, illuminating hopes for a bright future. Tybalt, a little confused, suddenly found himself walking across the square hand in hand with Romeo, who at that moment was becoming the object of admiration of the townspeople. Everyone was singing odes to him, welcoming the new beginning that promised to change destinies. As a reward for the peace agreement, the Montagues handed Tybalt a cup of drink, and he accepted the gift gratefully, feeling the weight of tension that had been squeezing his shoulders gradually ease away, leaving a feeling of relief. The spoon accidentally hitting the rim of the mug attracted the attention of the crowd, and everyone froze in anticipation, for the toast was ready, and with it the promise of a better future for all. Romeo, closing his eyes, began to remember with bitterness and regret those distant times when a cruel feud raged between their families, and how stupid and senseless it looked. There was pretense in his voice, but everyone believed every word. The crowd, in complete amazement, listened spellbound to the pompous speech of the young man, who stood with his mouth open and his eyes sparkling, as if greedily catching every moment, as if he were a priest of some ancient cult. Tybalt, standing awkwardly nearby, had absolutely no idea how to react to what was happening, and his mind was shrouded in confusion, not understanding how to behave in such a situation, what to do with the emotions that overwhelmed his soul. Romeo, however, with a caustic, ironic smile, firmly said that he wanted to thank Capulet for the first step towards reconciliation, boldly expressing his feelings as if it were an act of great virtue on his part. Tybalt, in complete confusion, was stunned to hear how Romeo, despite everything, did not utter a single bad word about him, but on the contrary said only kind and positive things, which was a real revelation for him and caused deep surprise. However, suddenly the words were cut off, and Romeo finally showed his true, creepy nature, as he laughed loudly and poured wine right on Capulet's head, not holding back his emotions, and showing a complete lack of respect. The cups made of fine porcelain fell to the ground with a loud crash, breaking into small pieces, symbolizing the destruction of not only the dishes, but also the fragility of their peaceful relationship. Romeo, unable to contain himself, began to laugh loudly and uncontrollably, calling Capulet a real idiot, and his words, filled with fury and contempt, sounded like a bolt of lightning, breaking the silence and creating the feeling that the air around was frozen with tension. The crowd froze in complete shock, not expecting from this seemingly ideal, handsome man such base meanness and betrayal that no one could have predicted even in their wildest fantasies. The cups clashed with each other with a loud clang, and the whole crowd began to rejoice at the new turn of events, for now everyone was sure that the Montagues had defeated Capulet, eliminating their rival from the battlefield. Tybalt, in despair, found himself on his knees before Romeo, who mockingly shouted in his face that he could not deceive him, either with cunning speeches or tricks, feeling completely superior to him. The man sighed heavily, feeling the wine trickle down his hair, and quietly and bitterly wondered aloud why the other man couldn't simply accept his goodwill for what it was without looking for hidden motives in every word. The mug rolled along the ground and stopped with a dull ringing sound, and Capulet, gathering his strength, clearly said that he had never started a fight with Romeo, despite everything that had happened in their lives, and the aggression that they were both now experiencing. Slowly, with obvious difficulty, Tybalt rose to his feet, his movements tense, and in front of him stood Romeo, who looked completely pleased with his bad behavior, as if enjoying every minute of his opponent's humiliation without the slightest regret. With rage blazing in his eyes, which were now bright red with anger, Tybalt angrily asked why Montagues had treated him so cruelly, stating that if he did not answer, his clothes would turn red with blood as a result of their disagreement. Romeo, remaining calm, was ready to demonstrate that the life of Capulet's cousin was connected with his destiny, that everything that happened between them left a deep mark that changed not only Capulet, but Romeo himself. The young man, lost in his memories, remembered how at the age of 5 he was a very small boy with big eyes full of hope and innocence, and how his life seemed cloudless, but the events that happened later destroyed this ideal. Everyone surrounded him with attention, giving him the best. Delicious food, beautiful handkerchiefs, new things, and each of these little things brought him incredible joy. He felt special being in the center of care and attention, as if the whole world was tuned only to him. The girls turned their attention to the sweet boy with delight, tenderly braiding his hair, showering him with compliments, and he, with sincere embarrassment, responded to their kind words, not realizing how quickly all this became a part of his little life. The other boys were not indifferent either. They admired their friend, perceiving him as a role model because even at such an early age, he knew how to behave with dignity, was engaged in fencing, and was an example for everyone. Then, suddenly, out of nowhere, Tybalt appeared, and in a loud voice with complete confidence, shouted that he was a much more skilled swordsman than Romeo. His words sounded like a challenge, breaking the idyll and forcing everyone to pay attention to this unexpected moment. And then Montagues, without holding back his emotions, expressed all his hatred for the young man, who seemed to have taken all the attention, leaving Romeo in the shadows. And now he was ready to show this indignation openly and without embarrassment. embarrassment. Tybalt, without losing his composure, reached out his hand to the mug from which the wine had just spilled, trying to pick it up, but his actions were so abrupt and aggressive that everything that was happening became more and more tense. The guy barely managed to catch the mug that was thrown at him, and words were thrown in his face, accusing Romeo of his behavior, directly provoking a fight. And despite his attempts to be calm, the situation was getting tenser with each passing moment. Smashing his mug on the floor, Montague said with fury and anger that he had always hated Capulet, and his words burst out like a fiery stream, as if he wanted to finally get rid of this feeling that had long been accumulating in his soul. But most of all, he hated the guy who stood in front of him with black hair from which drops of spilled wine were dripping, and his eyes were blazing with rage like two fiery torches ready to destroy everything in their path. Suddenly, Romeo, unable to contain himself, began to laugh, evilly mocking the Tybalt family, saying that they were completely unworthy of anything, incapable of greatness, and his words cut the air like sharp knives, leaving no room for forgiveness. Tybalt, unable to bear it, grabbed the collar of his interlocutor with his hand, and with a furious look aggressively pulled him towards himself, shouting for him to repeat his words, making it clear that he would not tolerate insults and was ready for action. Romeo, sensing the aggression, began to tease Tybalt, but suddenly he remembered that the man might have had a younger sister, and this thought slipped into his head as something familiar and even somewhat painful. Cruelly, with contempt, the aristocrat began to mock that Juliet would hardly marry, and in that case she would become a servant for his family, not deserving a better fate, and his words sounded like a knife stab, causing Tybalt to feel bitterness and humiliation. Tybalt, unable to bear it, reacted sharply, and a heavy blow, a slap, stunned him, leaving red marks on his cheeks that burned with rage and pain, as if a symbol of how easily honor could be destroyed in the blink of an eye. The men, overcome with anger, fell to the ground, and a fight began, their fists meeting with such force that each blow was met with shouts from the crowd, who watched every movement with anticipation, feeling the tension rising. Tybalt stood with a swollen eye, wet from spilled wine, and wounded appeared before his sister. His face expressed complete frustration mixed with pain, and despite his aggression, he could not hide his inner experience. Juliet, dressed in a white dress with a slight smile on her lips, calmly asked how her brother's day had gone and sat on the bed enjoying the moment of calm, but in her eyes there was anxiety that found no rest. With his hands clasped behind his back, the boy modestly replied that he was not seriously injured, his words sounding restrained and calm, as if he was trying to calm everyone around him, although in fact behind this there was a storm of feelings and thoughts that he tried to keep inside. Tybalt sighed heavily, his hand hanging limply in front of him, as he was asked what happened, why he fought with Romeo, and he didn't know how to explain what was happening, because the feelings were too vivid and words couldn't convey them. The night was full of mysteries. The moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the dark towers of the castle, and the air was cold, giving everything around a sense of alienation, as if the world itself began to move away from those who were in it. The lady, with a worried expression on her face, asked how it was that the relationship between the boys had only gotten worse, and her voice sounded as if she was looking for an explanation, not wanting to believe that it couldn't have been any other way. Tybalt, with fury in his voice, shouted that he could no longer stand aside when Montagues, with such contempt, laughed at their family as if not noticing how he was humiliating the honor of his family, and this moment was the last straw for his patience. Cruelly, with a shadow on her face, Juliet replied that Tybalt had not done enough to save his real cousin, and her words sounded like a reproach that fell on him with unexpected force, making him feel that he had failed those close to him. Biting her finger, the girl admitted that she was deeply disappointed in her interlocutor, and her face reflected all the feelings that had been accumulating in her soul: disappointment, pain, and bitterness from the fact that her expectations had been destroyed. After all, it turned out that his ego meant much more to him than saving his own relative and her life, although it was at stake, could not compete with his own ambitions and desire to preserve his pride, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Insistently, with a bright expression of displeasure on her face, Juliet asked why Tybalt had not done as she asked him, her voice sounding almost like an accusation, as if she could not understand why her requests had not been heard. Bowing before the lady, Tybalt was lost in thought, and the only thing that tormented his thoughts was why everyone around him was taking it out on him, shouting and getting angry as if he was guilty of what was happening. The lady, not noticing his silence, continued her pompous speech, as if trying to emphasize the importance of her words and emphasize her superiority, but suddenly the man harshly stopped her, ordering her to be silent, and his words sounded like a sentence in which there was not a drop of concession. The maiden froze, hearing the cold words of the interlocutor about how he no longer wanted to participate in her cunning affairs and insidious plans, and her gaze became gloomy, as if there was a mixture of disappointment and a desperate struggle for control in it. Tybalt closed his eyes and promised that he wouldn't tell anyone, but he emphasized that he wouldn't help her anymore, and there was a firmness in his voice as if it was a final decision that wasn't up for discussion. On the bed, under the dim light, lay a blade that gleamed dangerously. Its deadly sharpness seemed ready to strike, and every glance at it made the heart beat faster, as if a premonition of imminent danger. With determination, with a gleam in her eyes, the beauty grabbed the weapon from the bed, her fingers tightened on the handle, and there was a hint of danger in her movements, as if she were preparing for something inevitable that would change the course of events. The beauty literally sank down on the bed, holding the blade behind her back, her posture tense and full of determination, as if she was ready not only to defend herself, but also to take on the burden that came from this weapon. Displeased with her former ally's decision, the maiden muttered bitterly that it was a complete bummer, her words sounding like a curse reflecting all her frustration and disappointment in the man she once shared a side with. A cold gleam in her eyes filled with almost tangible hatred was reflected in her gaze. Juliet suddenly realized with icy clarity that in this cruel world she could only rely on herself, and no one, not even the closest person, would become her support. The night, full of silence and mystery, was dimly illuminated by the moon, whose soft silver rays touched the trees and thin trunks, creating an atmosphere of mystery in which it seemed that nature itself was hiding something unusual, mystical, and inexplicable. In the office, where tall shelves were filled with books and a window provided dim light, a stern voice was heard that sharply condemned the interlocutor, scolding him for the fact that his actions led only to trouble and not to something more constructive. The hand pushed the chessboard aside, and its movement was decisive, as if it was trying to get rid of everything that was interfering with her thoughts, making room for something more important and meaningful. The man looked away, his gaze hidden from everyone, while the cruel voice continued to scold his companion, not giving him the slightest chance to justify himself, as if every word was aimed straight at the heart. Romeo was on his knees, his arms hanging limply at his sides, unable to find words or justification for his stupid actions. The weight of his impotence, which he felt like a leaden burden, pressed on his soul, reminding him of the consequences he himself had caused. The Lord of the Montagues family was deeply upset. His face reflected inner pain. He could not find the strength to behave with dignity, and at this moment he felt how his reputation was crumbling before his eyes, and the family was losing its dignity. The boy looked at the floor, his silence a canvas across which fear slid his face covered in sweat, and his eyes filled with horror at what he felt as a rising wave of condemnation from his father. The chess pieces stood on the board ready for the next move, but their position was not random. Each of them stood in its place, as if reflecting the order of the game where everything went in turn, and each move could be decisive. The fist hit the table with a bang, and the man continued to scold his son, condemning him for not even being able to hold a sword in his hands. Each of his reproaches sounded like a sentence that left only bitterness. Romeo listened quietly to these words addressed to him, and a feeling of helplessness grew inside him. He simply could not behave worthy of the heir of his family, and this tormented him more than any other reproach. The boy's mentor watched with a smirk as his student bore the brunt of the weight, showing no sympathy. The man knew that the boy had to learn through pain and humiliation to become better. Bitter tears streamed down Romeo's face when, despite his efforts and suffering, he was compared to his late mother, reproached for his weakness and inability to cope with the burden of responsibility that fate had placed on him. Seeing his friend suffering, the man only turned away, not wanting to look at this pitiful sight, as if all feelings were alien to him, and he could not understand why he should waste time on sympathy when everything had already been decided. Covering his face with his hand, the man said bitterly that if Romeo took his place and headed the family, then the future of their family would be in an extremely deplorable situation, consumed by failures and dangers that would destroy all their hopes. Suddenly, another Montagues intervened, gently asking his uncle to calm down, because in his opinion, anger is like a weapon that can sever not only ties, but also health, and therefore such rage should be avoided, so as not to cause harm to oneself. Romeo continued to cry inconsolably, hiding his face behind his hand. His heart squeezed with pain until his mentor, holding back his anxiety, promised the head of the family that the young man would mend his ways and return to the path of correction, despite all the trials and difficulties that awaited him. Soon the nobleman left the hall, leaving the two guys alone in a vast room where the silence like fog and the darkness like a thick curtain only increased the tension, as if squeezing the space around, filling it with thick, heavy air. Grabbing Romeo's arm roughly, the youth uncompassionately ordered him to stop crying, claiming that as an heir of high status, he should not show weakness in such situations. The guy, not wanting to tolerate such humiliating treatment, abruptly pulled his hand out of the grip and, with complete contempt in his voice, said that if no one appreciated him, then let Benvolio lead their family and take on all the responsibilities since it was so important. The chess piece, standing alone by the window as a symbol of detachment and loneliness, became a silent witness to the growing conflict between the guys, which only intensified, absorbing everything around into an atmosphere of misunderstanding and anger. Romeo stood there lost in sadness and asked with longing why no one noticed his true essence hidden behind the outer shells and the wrong judgments of those around him, leaving him alone with these immutable questions. His interlocutor roughly pushed Romeo aside, not bothering to respond to his words, and with a cold expression on his face walked past as if not noticing the suffering of the young man, who, standing in the shadows, was immersed in his invisible pain, feeling how hard it was for him. Benvolio was left alone, deep in thought. His thoughts would not let go, and the words of Romeo, the heir to the head, still echoed in his ears, making him doubt the correctness of what was happening and whether they had chosen the right path in this confusing situation. At this time, Juliet sat in front of the mirror, her back covered with many scars, and her gaze was full of determination, as she firmly said that she could not allow herself to make a single mistake, despite the gravity of her situation. The mansion was filled with noise and hubbub. The guests were excitedly discussing the upcoming ball, which was approaching faster and faster, and everyone's hearts, as if beating in unison, were filled with anticipation, creating an atmosphere in which the air seemed saturated with inexpressible excitement. The nanny noted with undisguised delight that the upcoming ball would be the first in the life of their charming young Juliet, and therefore the event promised to be special and exciting for the whole family, leaving a mark in her memory for the rest of her life. Servants scurried around the spacious halls of the mansion, animatedly discussing how best to decorate the rooms and prepare so that their young mistress could remember this festive evening as one of the most significant and wonderful moments of her youth. Tybalt was dressed in exquisite formal attire, where white and black were harmoniously combined, and his elegant appearance was complemented by a hat gracefully held in his hand, which gave him sophistication and nobility. The man, lightly rubbing his neck with his hand, calmly said that the servants should no longer worry about his appearance, but concentrate their efforts on other tasks that required their attention before the important event. Suddenly, the guy's expression changed, and his mood darkened as he remembered his cousin's recent 20th birthday and their last fight, which left a heavy and unpleasant residue in his soul that he couldn't just forget. Juliet, who was now standing next to him, no longer seemed to him the sweet and dear girl she had been before, because in front of him stood a complete stranger, distant both in distance and in his soul. At that moment, Tybalt realized that he had lost his last chance, which could have allowed him not only to save his cousin, but also to return her former warmth and sincerity that once connected them. Lowering his head with an expression of deep regret, the guy mentally reproached himself for not being able to bring to life everything he had long dreamed of doing for the sake of his cousin, who had always remained for him not just a relative, but a dear person. In his heart, he imagined how on the day of her debut, he would be next to her, supporting her and holding her hand tightly, becoming a real support for her at that important moment when she first came out into the world. The dreamer saw how he could help his cousin meet worthy young men, and if Juliet found her love, Tybalt without hesitation would help win the heart of the chosen one, doing everything to make her happiness a reality. Unexpectedly, Juliet entered the hall dazzlingly beautiful in her exquisite snow-white dress, decorated with fresh flowers which emphasized her youthful charm and created the image of a real princess from a fairy tale. Tybalt himself rose hastily to his feet on hearing the news of the arrival of his cousin, whose heart he so desired to win back, hoping that this meeting would be the beginning of a reconciliation and the restoration of their former intimacy. However, instead of the expected smile and warmth, Juliet only coldly turned her gaze away, as if deliberately ignoring her cousin's presence, leaving Tybalt with a feeling of detachment that echoed painfully in his soul. Suddenly, on a sudden impulse, the swordsman grabbed Juliet's arm tightly, forcing her to stop, and with desperate determination said that she would have to listen to him because this conversation was necessary for both of them to clarify many things. However, Juliet moved away with obvious indignation, sharply slapping away the stranger's hand, clearly intending to continue ignoring her cousin, demonstrating with her behavior a complete lack of desire to engage in any kind of dialogue. But Tybalt was persistent and showing firmness took her hand again, this time with both palms trying to be both gentle and confident, as if he hoped to convey his sincere intentions through touch. With a cold and arrogant look, sweet Juliet spoke words filled with contempt, asking how he dared to touch her since she considered such actions unacceptable, especially after their quarrel. In response, the swordsman sincerely asked for forgiveness for his previous mistakes, admitted his guilt before his cousin, and with a trembling voice begged to give him another chance, so that he could prove that he was capable of improving and earning her trust. Quietly, and with some uncertainty, Juliet listened to the words of her interlocutor, although she could not fully understand what exactly he needed from her, and why he came to her at this hour, when doubts and anxiety reigned in her soul. Standing in the spacious room, Tybalt spoke to his interlocutor, feeling a little relieved that he had finally stopped being ignored, and also perhaps that his sincere apology, which he considered an important step in restoring the relationship, had been accepted. Suddenly, the noblewoman removed the daisy that adorned her hair from her graceful hair and addressed her companion in a soft voice, asking him to extend his hand to her as if trying to demonstrate a gesture of trust or convey something important. The adult man, without any unnecessary questions or delays, obediently extended his hand forward, wanting to fulfill the request of the girl in whose actions he sensed some hidden intention, causing him curiosity and slight anxiety. The woman carefully placed a daisy bracelet on his wrist, as if this symbol of reconciliation spoke louder than any words, conveying a deep sense of hope for a new chapter in their difficult relationship full of trials and promises. The chandelier hanging from the high ceiling softly illuminated the room, creating a cozy atmosphere around where every object was filled with mysterious light and warm shades, enhancing the feeling of a moment of reconciliation. The nobles, in their exquisite attire, had already filled the main hall, and the long-awaited ball began its solemn procession filled with music, lively conversations, and whispers, which intertwined, creating an atmosphere of celebration and secular grace. A crowd of aristocrats slowly moved around the spacious hall, exchanging polite remarks, refined compliments, and sometimes unambiguous hints, making the evening even more lively and multifaceted. Tybalt, visibly nervous and restless, turned to his cousin, trying to contain his anxiety, to clarify whether she was ready for her appearance, which was supposed to be the culmination of the evening and attract everyone's attention to her. They entered the spacious hall together. Juliet, transformed beyond recognition, looked like the embodiment of refined beauty, and her cousin Tybalt accompanied her with confidence and pride, as if protecting her from unnecessary glances and attention from others. The girl gave the audience a gentle, barely noticeable smile that charmed everyone who stopped to look at her. The lady looked like the embodiment of innocence and grace, resembling in her appearance a delicate flower, like the daisies that adorned her hair. However, as soon as the fans started to come closer, Tybalt cooled their ardor with a menacing look, forcing those who were ready to throw themselves at her feet to show their admiration and confess their feelings to stop. Juliet, accustomed to attention, was never alone for a minute. She was surrounded by high society eager to communicate with her, and everyone considered it an honor to spend at least a moment in her exquisite company. Tybalt stood a little to the side, watching his cousin carefully, his gaze slightly intense, as he could not forget the request she had once asked him to fulfill, and now he felt responsible for fulfilling it. His task was clear: to warn the girl when Romeo, known for his reputation as a womanizer and a jerk, would be arriving at the ball. Tybalt, standing aside, could not help but feel animosity towards the young man, knowing that he would have to report it. Finding the guy turned out to be an extremely difficult task because there was a real commotion in the hall, and numerous people talking and moving in different directions only complicated the search, creating a feeling of chaos and uncertainty. Suddenly, a loud cry was heard, and the husband, looking at his wife in fear, hastened to ask what had happened. The lady merely pointed to her dress, explaining that someone had spilled a drink on her, which had ruined the outfit. The young man with dazzlingly blonde hair, not paying attention to those present, roughly walked forward, mercilessly pushing the nobleman aside as if not noticing him. The man, feeling growing irritation and anger, shouted loudly and angrily at the guy, demanding that he immediately apologize for his outrageous behavior, brazenly ignoring all norms of decency and demonstrating complete disregard for those around him. However, as soon as the icy gaze of blue eyes was directed at the man, his confidence disappeared and he immediately fell silent, as if burned, succumbed to internal fear, and retreated without hesitation, not daring to continue the argument. The mysterious young man, not paying attention to the hustle and bustle around him, resolutely grabbed a glass of wine from the tray, and without wasting a second, quickly began to drink, consuming the drink as if it was the only thing that could calm him down at that moment. Romeo stood before him dressed in elegant new clothes and hiding his face behind a mask. Rolling his eyes in obvious displeasure, he said sharply that the wine at this ball was so tasteless that even the most refined palate could not appreciate it. The handsome man, making his way through the crowd, became more and more immersed in his thoughts with each step, feeling how everything around him was beginning to irritate him. The many people, the noise, and every little thing seemed to only aggravate his inner discontent. The women watched this handsome man with obvious interest. Their gazes followed his every movement, and a curious fire burned in their eyes. They clearly could not hide their admiration for his appearance. However, Romeo did not feel the slightest curiosity towards these ladies. His heart was consumed by fatigue from constant attention, and he had long since ceased to find satisfaction in such looks and compliments. He lazily reached out his hand to the new glass of wine, his fingers touched the cold glass, and he raised the glass with an imperturbable expression, as if he was completely absorbed in his own thoughts and oblivious to the world around him. The man drank the wine in one gulp without slowing down. His face did not show any emotion, as if it was something familiar, not requiring attention, and he simply continued to follow his thoughts and inner experiences. Romeo grabbed the glass with fury and threw it with all his might towards the glasses standing nearby, and they broke with a deafening sound, and the glass cracked, flying in all directions, adding tension to the scene. Staggering with anger and tension, sweet Romeo, unable to contain his emotions, slowly walked towards the vase containing the bright red flowers, as if their calmness and beauty were causing him more and more irritation. One of the red plants, unable to withstand Romeo's fury, was roughly torn from its vase and thrown to the floor, and its scarlet petals, as the last witnesses of his emotions, scattered, and the scent of the flowers quickly disappeared into the air. With boiling anger, the boy mercilessly stepped on the flower, trampling it with fury, as if trying to destroy everything that stood in the way of his anger, not paying attention to its fragility and beauty, which were now only a symbol of vulnerability for him. The nobles, shocked by his behavior, stared in shock at the floor where the trampled flower lay, while Romeo, ignoring their gaze, walked forward in irritation, feeling like he was being treated like a child deprived of independence. Benvolio was considered by all to be the more suitable candidate for the role of head of the family. His calmness and common sense were considered important qualities for such a high position, which in the opinion of many, Romeo lacked. Tybalt, for his part, was not only a staunch warrior, but also an outstanding swordsman whose bravery and skill in battle left little doubt as to his ability to defend the honor of his family if need be, and his presence commanded respect among the most experienced fighters. Biting his lip, Romeo couldn't understand why he was worse than everyone else, why he couldn't achieve what was so easy for others, and this internal question haunted him like a stone in his soul. The aristocratic mansion was truly magnificent. High ceilings, exquisite decoration, and flags fluttering in the wind gave the room a special solemnity, as if reminding of the grandeur and wealth of this place. Suddenly the boy stopped, hearing a whisper from the crowd which reached him like the sounds of a muffled conversation. People were discussing how especially the night Tybalt had dressed up today, and his appearance became a real topic of conversation, attracting the attention of everyone around. The noblewomen, leaning towards each other, whispered that Tybalt seemed to have dressed in this way especially for his cousin, with whom he had come to the ball. The gesture was perceived as an obvious attempt to emphasize his affection for her, which aroused in their eyes barely concealed curiosity and condemnation. A bright bough was tied to the furniture in front, adding even more brightness and color to the atmosphere of the evening, as if symbolizing the importance of the moment that was playing out right before them. Romeo, without thinking, came forward and tore off the bow and threw it angrily on the floor, as if he was trying to get rid of everything that reminded him of what was happening. The masculine gesture was sharp and decisive, as if a protest against everything. Suddenly the boy was faced with the angry gaze of his eternal rival, which was full of rage and contempt, and those red eyes made poor Romeo feel his heart squeeze with fear and dislike. Frightened, Romeo turned sharply and hurried away, unable to bear this tense clash of gazes. The nobleman quickly walked away, trying to hide from what filled his soul with anxiety and internal conflict. The man's foot paused next to the torn ribbon, and he paused for a moment to look at this small but bright symbol, as if this random object had suddenly become important to him, forcing him to think about what had happened. Romeo, stepping around the corner, suddenly stopped and thought maybe he really should just go home, get away from all these tense situations and experiences that only added unnecessary anxiety and worry. When suddenly, as if from nowhere, Tybalt appeared next to him and, without giving the slightest sign of joy, greeted him in a sullen and sharp tone. This made Romeo start in surprise, and the cold fear that seized him forced him to involuntarily cry out. Annoyed and with a cold gaze, the swordsman said that he had promised someone not to harm Romeo, but that did not mean that he would be restrained with him forever, and any further actions on the part of the boy could lead to unpleasant consequences. A pink torn cloth was thrown in the handsome man's face, and the gesture was so abrupt that he felt his mood immediately worsen, and his irritation began to grow like a wave. The guy again felt uncomfortable with the words of his interlocutor, who, like many others, did not hesitate to criticize him and give orders indicating how he should behave, which only increased his internal tension and anger. Having knocked his companion's hand away, Romeo resolutely said that the only mistake in this situation was perhaps Tybalt himself, who continued to interfere in his affairs, not realizing that his actions only made the situation worse. It was the swordsman's turn to stand and listen, as he was accused of dressing up so carefully for his cousin, and that his attire was so spectacular that it was hard not to notice how strong his feelings for her were, that he might have felt something more. The handsome man put his hand on his interlocutor's shoulder, looking with some regret at his excessive sensitivity, as if he pitied him for such experiences, but he could not help but feel a slight irritation from this. With a slight smile that barely touched his lips, Romeo whispered in the swordsman's ear that he was probably not just friends with Juliet, but there was clearly something more between them that could not be hidden even behind their outward calm. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and the lady, clearly interested, instantly turned towards the sound, watching what was happening with lively curiosity, as if this moment had suddenly become the center of her attention, not allowing her to remain indifferent. Romeo, feeling a painful sting in the cheek where he had been hit, grabbed it and, unable to hold on, sank to the floor, feeling the pain gradually spread across his face, preventing him from getting up. The lady coldly told the man not to stand in her way anymore, and to stay away, leaving behind a shadow of determination, as if her words were the last warning for him from which there was no turning back, and her posture radiated confidence. The man, unable to contain his growing anger, abruptly rolled up his sleeves as if preparing to resolve the conflict, and with a challenge in his voice suggested to his companion that they deal with them once and for all, only with their fists, without unnecessary words and misunderstandings to put an end to this. The nobles, noticing the growing tension, began to whisper among themselves. Surprise and curiosity were visible in their eyes, because they had witnessed a fight in which representatives of two great and warring families, the Montagues and the Capulets, clashed. Romeo remembered the cruel words spoken to him earlier, that if he caused trouble again he would be severely punished. The words rang in his head like thunderclaps, reminding him of the consequences of his actions, and he felt a tension grip his soul. Romeo's entire body was covered in cold sweat from fear, and his face became wet as if beads of sweat were rapidly running down his skin, as if reflecting the internal storm that had captured his mind and soul. He could not rise to his feet as they were shaking as if they were not able to support his body, and each step he took would be like trying to walk on a shaky bridge, ready to collapse under his weight. Tybalt, completely oblivious to the state of his interlocutor, ordered him in a sharp and cold voice to rise immediately, as if his order were an immutable law that did not tolerate the slightest delay or disobedience. But before Romeo could say or do anything, he was interrupted by the voice of his cousin Tybalt, who gently but firmly asked the man to allow her to speak with him alone, putting a note of persistence and firmness into her request. After this, Juliet grabbed her relative by the hand and quickly led him into the crowd, trying to lead him away from Romeo to hide from his gaze and divert attention from what was happening, as if afraid that his suffering would become obvious. Everyone's attention was diverted, and finally Romeo, having recovered somewhat from the strain, slowly began to rise, his movements hesitant, as if his body was not immediately agreeing with his wishes, and his mind was struggling with the realization of reality. The door slammed shut with a loud sound, and it became dark inside, as if the world around him had been swallowed by impenetrable darkness, blocking all roads and depriving him of the opportunity to see anything, leaving only a dull feeling of hopelessness. The girl was left alone with the guy who, looking down, admitted that he had no other choice and asked for forgiveness, as if trying to justify his actions, in the hope that this would soften her heart and lessen her guilt. Tybalt stood there, an irritated expression frozen on his face, his lips barely moving, trying to utter excuses directed at the beautiful woman, but his words sounded empty and meaningless because she did not seem ready to believe in his sincerity. At that moment, a loud slap fell on the surprised young man, who did not even have time to realize what was happening, since he did not expect such a sharp gesture, and his face immediately turned red from surprise and shame. The girl, raising her hand high with a determined and almost contemptuous expression on her face, said rudely that Tybalt was absolutely useless, and her words echoed in the air like a sentence finally depriving him of any hope of forgiveness. The lady coldly told the man not to stand in her way anymore, and to stay away, leaving behind a shadow of determination, as if her words were the last warning for him from which there was no turning back, and her whole posture radiated confidence that this was the final decision. The girl, without looking back, walked away, leaving the guy in the empty hall where he stood alone, holding his wounded cheek, as if his pain was only a reflection of the inner emptiness that had enveloped him, while no footsteps or words were heard around. Tybalt looked at his relative in confusion, as she ordered him to disappear from her life forever for the last time, and his mind could not immediately comprehend the full weight of her words, which sounded like a sentence that deprived him of his last hope. Silence filled the room, where the tall white columns and exquisite architecture created a sense of isolation and helplessness, emphasizing the emptiness that pervaded the place like an unfilled gap between it and the world around it. Tybalt remained motionless, looking out the large window through which the night penetrated the building, his gaze absorbed by the silence and heaviness that had taken hold of his soul as he stood alone in that endless cold. The hat lay forgotten on the floor as the nobleman walked away without looking back, feeling that he no longer cared about the fate of his relative, and this thought lay heavily on his heart, like a final admission of his helplessness. The light burned brightly despite the night, and its bright rays filled the space, but in the hall itself, enveloped in the atmosphere of the ball, the soft glow of the candles was created, as if to hide the gloomy mood and solitude that reigned in this place. Romeo, deciding to break out of the cramped walls, went out onto the balcony to breathe some fresh air, and his soul was tormented by anxiety. He was afraid that someone might recognize him, and every rustle behind him made his heart beat faster. The guy didn't notice how his solitude was broken by a lady who quietly approached him from behind, speaking softly to him, asking if he was okay, and her words sounded like a light but persistent interest in his condition, as if trying to see something hidden in his gaze. It was sweet Juliet who, noticing how uncomfortable Romeo was, approached him with concern, showing care and interest, and her face showed genuine concern for his condition and inner experiences. Romeo responded irritably that everything was fine, and explained that he was just the guy who always got into trouble, and as everyone thought couldn't stay out of trouble, which caused a bitter irony in his voice. The lady did not lose her optimism, continuing to play the role of a naive fool who was worried about the guy next to her. Her words sounded with a slight hint of pretense, as if she was sincerely worried about his feelings, but her smile betrayed something else. The handsome man winced when the lady said she thought Tybalt was more of a thorn in his side than a real nuisance, and the words struck him as a shock to think how much those around him underestimated the difficulties he faced. The girl leaned against the balcony railing and, looking at Romeo, said that the swordsman always started the fight first, as if her words were the key to understanding how important initiative was in their world, where every step could be decisive. The beauty, watching her cousin with a slight shade of pity on her face, could not hide how often he was annoying and caused a lot of trouble, but her look expressed more regret than real anger or condemnation. Romeo himself listened to his interlocutor with interest, because she was the person for whom Tybalt was ready to do everything, and in this amazing context, every word of hers seemed more significant than simple communication, as if he was looking for an answer to a riddle. There was a silence between the young couple, as the girl and boy stood next to each other, and in that moment the world around them seemed to stop, allowing them to think about what could have happened if the circumstances had been different and their feelings had been sincere and understandable. Suddenly, Romeo began to say that it would be better for him to leave, but his words were interrupted by his companion, who, without letting him finish his thought, decisively took the initiative into her own hands and interrupted him as if it were a matter of honor, not allowing him to doubt her decision. The lady extended her hand forward with a slight smile on her lips, and without giving him time to think, invited her interlocutor to dance with her, as if there was something unspoken in her proposal that beckoned and enchanted him. Music was playing in the hall, and the chandelier, sparkling with bright light, was illuminated by the rays of candles, creating an atmosphere of mystery and magic, as if every movement of the dancers was part of this magnificent performance. The beauty twirled smoothly in the dance. Her movements were graceful and light, as if she was the embodiment of beauty itself, and each of her turns was like a promise of something exciting and unpredictable in this exciting moment. Romeo smoked tiredly, not understanding how he had ended up in a situation where he couldn't just leave, and his thoughts were confused, as if he was trapped where every step was predetermined, and his freedom no longer mattered. The crowd standing nearby watched the Capulet lady closely as she danced with the masked stranger, their eyes following her every move because she was the center of attention, and her mystery only fueled their interest. Juliet sang joyfully, addressing her companion with a slight sincerity in her voice, asking him not to judge her harshly, because this was the first ball in her life, and she felt free at this moment as never before without thinking about the consequences. Smiling broadly, the beauty invited the man to continue dancing without stopping, her eyes glowing with pleasure, and it seemed that she did not notice her companion's fatigue, ready to dance until the very end. Unlike the other guys who looked at the lady with loving eyes, Romeo remained indifferent. His gaze was tired, and despite all the splendor of what was happening, he could not get rid of the feeling of anxiety and fatigue that overwhelmed him. Unable to refuse, the young man, holding back his displeasure, grabbed the noblewoman by the waist and began to dance again, although his movements were full of reluctance, as if his body did not agree with the continuation of this lifeless waltz. Suddenly, the beauty, miscalculating her steps, stepped on her companion's foot, and he winced from the pain, his face distorted from the sharp sensation which was so unexpected and painful that his thoughts were interrupted for a moment. By the end of the dance, the guy's leg was hurting badly because the lady had not only stepped on him, but also trampled him mercilessly, and every step was now torture, but his face remained inconspicuous, hiding all the pain as well as his inner irritation. Romeo said with irritation that his companion had rather mean legs, and this remark made her blush because she did not expect such a straightforward answer, which soon made her feel awkward. Suddenly, hearing whispers from the crowd, the couple noticed Tybalt's disappearance, and this barely audible sound became unexpectedly loud among the many conversations, as if everyone around suddenly realized that something important had happened, and he disappeared as if he had dissolved into thin air. Montagues, intrigued by this incident, looked back, for the swordsman was his rival, and his sudden disappearance alarmed him, giving him no peace, for every such moment could hide a danger or betrayal that he could not foresee. Juliet grabbed her knees with her hands and turned to the guy, asking if he was really so worried about other people's rumors, and her words, full of light mockery and surprise, seemed to challenge him to a frank answer, forcing him to think about his real experiences. The girls on the side were discussing who was more handsome, Tybalt or Romeo, and despite their seemingly carefree behavior, there was a slight envy and excitement in their conversations, as if this was the main question at the ball. The man wondered to himself why everyone was staring so intently at his swordsman enemy, even though there was nothing special about him. His thoughts seemed unable to comprehend what it was about Tybalt that was attracting all the attention, while his own figure remained unnoticed. Laughing, Juliet asked if Romeo would also like to be as popular as her relative. Her words sounded with a slight mockery, as if they contained a hidden question about what her companion really wanted, but he was in no hurry to answer. Deep down, the boy was actually unhappy, and when his family announced that he had to attend the ball, he was not happy because all he felt was the weight of expectation and the stress of having to be part of this society. The stern Benvolio, who was also wearing a mask, explained to his relative that when a person puts on a mask, he ceases to be himself. His face becomes only a surface, and behind it are hidden other more hidden emotions and desires that are not visible at first glance. And finally, the young man admitted that he really did envy others, because every glance at those around him reminded him how easily they attracted attention and received recognition, which he himself could not achieve despite his efforts. Tybalt was the kind of person whose presence was enough to attract attention, and his confidence, like a magnet, attracted glances, creating an aura of power and strength around him that left no one indifferent. People gave him support without thinking. Their hands were always ready to support his back, as if it were a natural continuation of their admiration and respect for his personal strength, which was becoming the greatest value for him in this society. Juliet winced at the boy's frank words that he would have become a better swordsman if he had received even a drop of support, and these words hurt her deeply because she realized how hard it was for him to fight alone. Suddenly the lady smiled, leaning over her knees, and with confidence in her voice said that she was sure that Romeo would cope without anyone else's help because he was very strong and capable of overcoming any difficulties. The handsome man blushed from such words, shyly hiding his gaze. His heart beat faster, and he did not know how to answer because her support was unexpected for him, but so warm and sincere that it made him feel important. Even his ears turned red, the tips of which slightly reddened, betraying his embarrassment, as if he was not prepared for such a flow of positive emotions, and his face at that moment became a reflection of all those feelings that he had difficulty hiding. Pretending to be indifferent, the grown man turned away, coughing into his fist, trying to hide his emotions, and not show how worried he really was, because it was important for him to maintain a mask of cold calm in this situation. Benvolio passed by the couple and noticed the feelings that were growing between them, feelings that were forbidden because their families were feuding, and this hidden but bright fire between the two people became more and more obvious to him. The guy's gaze was cold. He understood that something was wrong. He felt that behind this silence and external indifference, there was something more that could not be a simple coincidence or a chance meeting. The night swallowed everything around the moon, dimly illuminated the trees, creating an atmosphere of silence and solitude in which it seemed that every word and every movement became important and filled with hidden meaning. The boy lay tiredly on the bed, his clothes scattered on the floor, and in this silence he felt even more alone, as if everything around him had slowed down, and his thoughts were spinning in circles, finding no way out as if he was stuck in himself. It was Tybalt who covered his eyes with his hand, his head hanging tiredly, unable to get rid of the thoughts of his cousin that did not leave him for a second, as if he was attached to these thoughts, and they did not give him peace. Their relationship, once full of tenderness and closeness, began to deteriorate rapidly, and dear Juliet, who had been so close to him, was now moving away as if an abyss was stretching between them, and he could not understand how and why everything had gone so inexorably wrong. Staring at the ceiling with red eyes, the man thought angrily about what he should do to fix everything, what steps he should take to return what was slipping away and restore those connections that seemed to have already been lost. He had a bracelet on his hand, a gift from a relative, and the flower petals carefully placed in its decoration began to fall as if symbolizing that everything around was gradually losing its freshness and color, like this bracelet, which was once a symbol of something significant. Tybalt stared at the flower in surprise, as if he suddenly understood something, as if this moment was the key to realizing that perhaps he had long ago missed some important detail that could change everything, and his thoughts became confused. The guy jumped out of bed, realizing that something was wrong with his lady, and perhaps someone had hurt her, as if an inner voice was warning him of a terrible and dreadful disaster that could already be near, but he did not know how to prevent it. The trees stood on the street, their branches swaying in the light wind, and someone's loud crying was heard all around, filling the night silence like echoes of pain and loss that merged with nature at that moment, revealing their suffering. It was Tybalt who was crying loudly. His cheeks were red from tears, and his face reflected all the inner chaos that tormented him, and it seemed that his grief could not be hidden. It burst out in this inconsolable pity for himself and what was happening. The little girl was nearby, surprised by her friend's crying, and she had a large book in her hands as if she was ready to use it to find an answer to what was happening, although she herself did not understand what exactly needed to be done. Coming closer, she asked the boy what had happened to him, her voice soft and worried, like someone who sincerely wanted to help, but could not fully understand what was really happening to the one she pitied so much. Tybalt sadly explained that the Montague boys laughed at him constantly and bullied him, and it was so painful for him that his soul seemed unable to bear the constant humiliating looks he received. All the Capulets had black hair or blue eyes, but the boy had neither. He felt like a stranger in his family and did not even know who his mother was, because all he remembered was a feeling of loneliness and alienation that never left him. And so Tybalt wept sadly, not knowing whether he had any right to call himself Capulet at all, for every doubt and every memory of his only strengthened his inner feeling that he was a stranger, even among those who should have been close to him. Suddenly, Juliet slapped him sharply across the cheeks, and Tybalt screamed from the surprise and pain, not expecting such a gesture from her, because his heart was already full of doubts, and this blow became an unexpected shock for him, which deprived him of any opportunity to think calmly. There was a large mansion around, and the nature surrounding it seemed calm, as if nothing was happening. But Tybalt's inner world was in a furious storm, and every sound, every shadow seemed to punish him for everything he could not understand or change. Suddenly, the little lady gave her friend a daisy bracelet, saying that from now on, it would be a sign that he was part of their family, as a symbol of affection and love that would always be with him wherever he was. After which she showed that she herself wore exactly the same jewelry as he did, and this became another reminder that he was not alone in this world, that there was someone who would always be there despite all the difficulties and disagreements between their families. Sitting down next to him, Juliet asked the boy not to think about the bad things anymore, because he would always be part of their family, and her words were full of confidence, as if she could promise him protection and warmth throughout his life. Tybalt blushed shyly, his big eyes filled with hope, and he looked at his relative, believing every word she said, because this was the first time someone had spoken such kind words to him, which he so needed to hear. The girl pressed herself against him and whispered that he should always remember that he was not alone, and when he doubted himself, when he lost faith, she would be there reminding him that he was important and loved despite all the circumstances. The aristocrat laughed merrily. Her laughter was full of sophistication and lightness, as if she was enjoying every moment, and everything around her turned into an exciting game where she was the center of attention, not noticing a single obstacle. Looking ahead, the boy suddenly froze, absorbed in memories of the past and the words of Juliet, who promised him that he should do everything she said, as if her voice was the only guide in this world for him determining all his actions. But the same words were said to him by the strange girl who had entered the body of his relative, and at that moment he began to doubt whether he was just a puppet in someone's hands, not realizing all the consequences. The man staggered to his feet, convincing himself that this had to be the real Juliet, otherwise there could be no other explanation for all these strange and unpredictable events that were happening to him. A lonely, abandoned chamomile flower remained on the bed, its petals gently swaying in the light draft, as if symbolizing the tenderness left by the one who once held it in her hands. On the street near the fountain, a young couple was talking, their voices merging with the sound of the water, creating an atmosphere of comfort and trust, in which every moment, despite its fleetingness, seemed important and priceless, filling the air with tenderness and warmth. Romeo was walking down the street with his companion, deep in thought about her question about what he really liked, while his mind wandered trying to figure out what really mattered to him in this complex and fleeting world. Having picked a scarlet flower, the handsome young man confessed to her that he liked to look at beautiful things, to admire the aesthetics of the world around him, which brought him peace and tranquility, giving meaning to the daily bustle. Handing the aristocrat a flower, Romeo laughed awkwardly, saying that it was probably strange that he as a man liked things like beautiful clothes, flowers, and objects that filled his soul with a slight delight. Reaching out for the gift, Juliet replied with a smile that she didn't think it was strange, her voice sounding soft and confident, as if she knew for sure that for her, there was no wrong thing to do. The guy looked at his companion in surprise, not expecting to receive condemnation from her for his words, and feeling her acceptance, an unusual feeling of lightness and calm arose in his heart, as if his inner torment had melted away. At that moment, Juliet looked simply magnificent. Her presence was magical. In her hands, she held a glowing object around which lights danced like fireflies, filling the entire space with a warm and mysterious light. Romeo himself felt his heart beat faster, as if he had fallen in love with this charming beauty, and his eyes literally filled with hearts, and his ears turned red from embarrassment and awkwardness, because her presence and energy captured him completely. Turning away, he asked with slight excitement what Juliet herself really liked in her partners, trying to understand her views and feelings, because she remained a mystery to him that he wanted to solve. It turned out that the lady liked men with a strong body, expressive muscles, and a sharp mind capable of not only delighting with their physical strength, but also captivating with deep thoughts, charm, and unique charisma, which hides within itself strength of spirit. Laughing, she admitted that it was only a slight exaggeration, a joke, and with a smile on her face, she ran her hand over a white flower that had grown on a nearby bush, as if gently throwing her words aside. After this, she added that she most appreciates those men who are able not only to listen, but also to understand her, those who can see and appreciate beauty, even in the smallest and simplest things hidden from prying eyes. Romeo listened to the lady's confessions with slight embarrassment, feeling his heart pounding wildly, for all this was new to him, and although her words were truly wonderful, he could not help but feel their weight, as if they imposed a responsibility that he was not prepared to accept. In a loud and confident voice, the man asked if he could find out the name of the lady who had charmed him so much, because her presence caused him strange but incredibly pleasant sensations that he could not explain. The girl froze near the flowers, feeling anxiety in her heart, as she admitted that she was afraid that her companion, having learned her name and past, might simply turn around and leave, leaving her alone in this world of secrets and uncertainty. However, she was ready to open her whole soul to him, to tell him about everything that was troubling her, if he promised to finish his lifelong journey next to her, despite all the fears and doubts that tormented her heart, making each step more and more difficult. The guy, covering his eyes with his hand, plunged into deep thought, feeling how his heart irrevocably belonged to this lady sitting opposite him, and realizing that now, no matter which path he chose, he would not be able to escape her influence. He extended his hand forward full of hope, asking her if she would accept his embrace, ready to open himself completely to her, to become not only a support for her, but also the very love that she might have been searching for all her life. Embarrassed Romeo wondered with a little excitement whether he could spend the rest of his life with this beautiful lady who seemed to be as surprised by his action as he was by her willingness to open up. Without thinking twice, Juliet extended her hand forward, ready to accept his offer, feeling an inner satisfaction that her cunning plan had worked, and now she could control the course of events, managing their communication. However, she suddenly turned away discreetly but confidently, asking the guy not to be so hasty because she understood that she should have held his interest a little, given him time to realize his feelings, and not let everything develop too quickly. The beauty with a slight bow walked away, suggesting that they could meet again a little later, after the masquerade, leaving dear Romeo in thought and filling his thoughts with an expectation that he could not fully understand. It took her longer to truly understand Romeo and discover his true essence, as she felt that his appearance was only a superficial shell hiding a much more complex and deep character that remained a mystery to her. The red, embarrassed guy did not expect such a sharp answer, and his face darkened with confusion because the girl's words confused him, and he did not know how to react to her mysterious request. The night enveloped the world in darkness, absorbing everything around in its shadows, and the moon, breaking through the thick clouds, barely illuminated the earth, filling the atmosphere with a feeling of the unknown and mysterious silence, as if the night itself was hiding its secrets. The room was in a commotion, the noise of voices, endless chatter, and the dim light of the lamps and candles only emphasized the atmosphere of the place, making everything around seem a little blurry and immersed in a mystical twilight. Inside the room, a couple of young people, confused and a little worried, stood nearby, and Juliet waved goodbye to Romeo, her gesture full of slight sadness, as if seeing him off at this moment of their short separation. Benvolio shuddered as he noticed his friend finally reappearing in his field of vision, and his heart filled with joy, for this was the long-awaited moment when everything returned to its place after the tense wait. Juliet returned to the women's company, sheepishly answering that she had only gone out to get some fresh air, but her gaze was full of secret thoughts, as if she herself did not fully understand what had just happened. Romeo, in turn, could not take his eyes off the beauty whose beauty filled his heart like the soft rays of the spring sun, penetrating into the very corners of his soul and making him forget about everything except her, as if time had stopped. Benvolio frowned, involuntarily folding his arms across his chest, thinking to himself that his relative was a real idiot for falling in love with a girl from a family with which they were at odds, and he couldn't understand how he couldn't see the obvious danger. In his dreams, Benvolio imagined how Juliet would become his bride, seeing her next to him, and in his imagination this union seemed much more reasonable and safe than the risky path of Romeo, who was carried away by her invisible magic. Romeo sadly tapped his finger on his face. His thoughts were carried away, far away. He had already managed to miss his beloved during this short time of separation, and the feeling of longing inside was growing stronger, as if his heart could not stand this temporary separation. When suddenly a strange hand fell on his shoulder, and a stern voice said that they needed to talk, the young man barely had time to turn around, when he felt that this conversation was inevitable, and he would have to listen to the interlocutor regardless of what he wanted. Leaning towards the charming Romeo, Benvolio whispered that he was crazy to have affairs with enemies when they had not come here to waste time on feelings, but to find out important rumors that could change everything. Romeo, irritably removing his hand from his shoulder, showed his friend with a gesture that he should no longer interfere in his affairs without saying a word, and in his eyes one could read firmness, a readiness to go his own way despite everything. The young man did not listen to his friend saying that his observations of him were too suspicious and clearly inappropriate, because his own Benvolio had no right to interfere in his personal affairs, especially when it came to men's feelings. The boy could not understand why Benvolio was so reserved and did not support his feelings for the young lady, despite all the evidence of this love which filled his soul with light and excitement, as if it were his destiny. Romeo, watching her, did not know what family she belonged to, but her charm was so strong that he could not take his eyes off her, feeling how her simple but deep charm gradually conquered his heart, making him forget about everything. Juliet walked slowly down the corridor, and the red curtains by the windows like flames painted her path in a bright shade, giving everything that was happening an atmosphere of mystery and grandeur, creating a truly mesmerizing contrast with her lightness and grace. Then suddenly Tybalt stopped her, grabbing her arm, not letting her move further. His decisive action made her freeze, and she felt the tension envelop her, but she couldn't understand what exactly he wanted to say with this. Romeo, in his shock, learned that his beloved was a Capulet, and this fact seemed to fall upon his consciousness with incredible force, destroying all his dreams and confidence, leaving him in confusion and despair. All the people who had gathered in the hall earlier were invited guests to honor the debut of the young beauty, and every look, every movement of Juliet now became an object of admiration and anticipation, as if foreshadowing an important event. The hall was decorated with majestic columns as if personifying ancient power, with stunning paintings on the walls, where white and gold accents combined, creating an atmosphere of noble luxury and eternal harmony. The relief portrait that hung in the center of the room depicted Juliet sitting with a gentle smile, as if her face was illuminated by the light of happiness, and this moment was forever recorded as a symbol of eternal beauty, and a moment that is not subject to time. Montague sighed heavily, absorbed by thoughts that did not give him peace. He could not understand how it happened that his heart was given to the daughter of his sworn enemy, the man he should have hated. Romeo, absorbed in his thoughts, tried to understand his feelings with surprise. Feeling a vague anxiety and a little confused, asked himself why this fact affected him so acutely, causing inner confusion and contradiction in his soul. In a rude and stern tone, Benvolio asked Romeo what made him believe that Juliet, beautiful and unpredictable, would choose him, since in her eyes there could be other more worthy candidates than himself, and this caused doubts in him. The handsome man frowned with obvious displeasure, and the man's face was distorted with anger, because the thought that the beautiful lady could choose someone else, someone not him, especially kindled resentment and a sense of injustice in him. Benvolio continued to mock his friend, asking him a sarcastic question. Did Romeo really believe that such a majestic and respected heiress of the Capulet family could fall in love with him, a guy with such an insignificant destiny? Juliet was a young and beautiful lady, and no one could understand why she would choose such a coward as Romeo Montagues, who couldn't even hold a sword in his hands with such a weak character and lack of determination. Moreover, everyone knew that Juliet and Tybalt were unusually close, and their relationship was often so close that their hands were always close, as if expressing not only family affection, but something more. Lady Juliet was probably aware of the cruel bullying that her cousin Tybalt was inflicting, and perhaps that was why her hatred of the Montagues was so strong, since their family differences had long been known. Romeo replied rudely, and with obvious irritation, that he did not believe Benvolio's words, not wanting to admit their truthfulness, because for him this thought was completely impossible and did not correspond to reality. The guy could not accept and believe that his beloved Juliet could be in love with another man. It seemed to him something completely absurd and unacceptable for his heart, which was completely devoted to her. Romeo suddenly smiled brightly. His smile was sincere and full of confidence as he addressed Benvolio, but there was still a hint of falseness in his voice, as if he was trying to hide his inner feelings. The man turned sharply to the side, and in a slightly mocking tone said that his friend did not understand anything about love at all, and therefore he should think before following him, otherwise he would only get even more confused. Benvolio sighed heavily, realizing that the heir of Montagues was so absorbed in his feelings and pride that he did not listen to his advice at all, and this realization filled his soul with confusion and regret. There was talk outside, and the stone walls surrounded by thick bushes seemed to be silent witnesses to everything that was happening, as if they were holding back all the emotions going on in this place. Tybalt, feeling embarrassed, sincerely apologized to Juliet for the pain he had caused her, realizing that his actions were not only inappropriate, but could also seriously affect her feelings, despite the fact that he had not wanted to cause her pain at all. As if trying to correct his mistakes, he grabbed her gentle hand, showing all his care and attention to his cousin, as if reminding her that despite their past disagreements and tense moments, he would always be there ready to support and protect in any situation. The guy finally realized that despite everything, Juliet continued to be his friend, but as soon as he tried to come closer, her cold voice interrupted him, reminding him that not everything was as simple as he would like. The maiden reminded him with cold firmness that she had clearly told him not to show himself in her sight. Her words sounded like an iron rule that he must not break, otherwise the consequences would be unpleasant for him. Pushing the men's hands away with an expression of complete indifference, she stepped aside. Her face was impassive, and such words of her relative did not have the slightest meaning for her, as if they did not even deserve her attention. Sternly, with fury in her eyes, she ordered the nobleman to stay away and not get in her way. Her gaze was full of determination and confidence, as if she was ready to defend her freedom and independence despite any obstacles. Tybalt was in complete shock. He was overcome with a feeling of confusion from her cold words, and not knowing what to do. He froze in his tracks, trying to comprehend what happened and why she pulled away, unable to understand what he did wrong. Suddenly, unable to bear the tension, he grabbed his cousin by the hand, trying to stop her so he could talk and perhaps find out what was going on, but his attempts only caused her even more irritation. Juliet pulled away from him with a heavy sigh and an irritated expression, her face completely indifferent, and it was obvious that she just wanted one thing: for her cousin to finally leave her alone and not try to interfere in her personal affairs without disturbing her peace. Meanwhile, Romeo, walking slowly along the road, tried to find a secluded place where he could be alone with himself to calm his thoughts and perhaps find at least the slightest clarity in the inner chaos that had engulfed his soul. Suddenly, Romeo witnessed a tense scene. Juliet, with anger in her eyes, pushing Tybalt aside, her gestures full of rage and her words filled with desperation, as if she wanted to break free from his control. Romeo, dumbfounded by what was happening, listened in horror as the cousins exchanged sharp remarks discussing some kind of deception, which added even more anxiety to his heart, making him doubt that he could ever understand Juliet's true intentions. Juliet responded rudely and with obvious malice to Tybalt that without the intervention of her relatives, it would have been much easier for her to win the Montagues' heart, as if she were trying to emphasize her independence and ability to cope with the situation without anyone's help. The nobleman listened with bewilderment to her words, in which she plainly declared that she intended to turn his head by making him fall in love with her. This revelation removed the rosy veil of love from his eyes, and he felt disappointment seize his heart. The girl screamed that Tybalt was supposed to just help her, but he couldn't even cope with such a simple task, and her voice was filled with disappointment and bitterness, as if he had betrayed her in the most important thing. Tybalt, listening to her harsh and rude words, recoiled as if these words were a blow to him that he did not expect. The youth did not know how to react, and overcome by a mixture of pain and confusion, stood in complete bewilderment. A sharp whistle was heard cutting through the silence of the night, and at that moment, the moon, large and bright, illuminated the dark sky over which clouds were slowly moving, hiding its light and giving the night an atmosphere of mystery and enigma. Looking down on him with arrogance and cold contempt, Juliet realized that Tybalt couldn't even handle such a frivolous and stupid idiot as Romeo, and this disappointment became a painful truth for her that was hard to come to terms with. The young man lowered his head, remaining in the shadows and listening to his beloved's conversation. He realized that she did not love him at all, but only sought to use him for dirty purposes, which was a real blow and deepest disappointment for him. He remembered the words of Benvolio, who called him a fool, a weakling who was deceived by everyone, and Romeo's heart was filled with bitterness, as if every step he took was a mistake, and he was just a pawn in someone else's game. Suddenly, Romeo, unable to cope with the wave of annoyance and emotion, laughed loudly. His laughter sounded filled with despair, as if trying to hide the pain he felt, despite the gravity of the situation. Juliet and Tybalt suddenly turned towards the laughter, surprised that they were not alone in the garden, their eyes filled with bewilderment as they realized that this moment had broken their own privacy. The young man, unable to contain his emotions, rushed to run, but in panic he tripped over a stone and, losing his balance, fell to the ground with a crash as if fate itself had decided to punish him for his weakness. Romeo fell to the ground, feeling his heart breaking with pain, mental and physical, and feeling a cold rush of despair in his body. He felt in tears that he could no longer cope with this burden. The mask of masquerade fell from his face and he remained simply himself, but in spite of his sincerity and honesty, everyone condemned him as if his authenticity had become for them a terrible crime that they could not forgive. Leaning his hands on the ground, the boy rose with difficulty, his gaze full of doubt, and he asked himself why everyone had fallen upon him, why his sincerity had become the subject of ridicule and contempt. Romeo, unable to hold back his tears, began to cry, promising himself to take revenge on all his offenders, swearing that someday they would see his strength when he became the one who could regain his honor and respect. With a hand filled with pain and despair, he grabbed the ground, his nails digging into the grass, as if this gesture could tear him from the network of painful thoughts and grievances that relentlessly tormented his soul, leaving only emptiness. It was all the fault of Tybalt Capulet, who was so close to his cousin and attracted too much attention to himself, as if his presence in Juliet's life was inevitable and her feelings predetermined. The guy lowered his head and, overcome with despair, ran through thoughts in his head about how to take revenge on Capulet, making him feel the pain and hopelessness that now tormented the guy, engulfing him completely. Suddenly, Romeo heard a strange voice calling him, and instantly turning around, he directed his fierce gaze towards the source of the sound, ready to meet any threat that could interrupt his mental storm. It was Juliet who was hurrying towards him with deep concern, her voice trembling with care, and she was asking if he was in pain, and her eyes full of sincere anxiety reflected all the care she felt for his well-being. It was Juliet who, full of deep concern, hurried to him, her voice barely holding back a tremor from concern, and she, with anxiety in her voice, asked if he was in pain, and her eyes full of sincere concern spoke of how worried she was about his condition. The noblewoman stopped near Montague's, her face full of determination, and she promised to tell all about her quarrel with her cousin, as if this story could be the beginning of a path to reconciliation and understanding. With a smile, the girl suggested discussing what he had overheard, but Romeo, not wanting to delve into this conversation, rudely refused, assuring that he was fine despite everything that was happening. The man, trying to ease the tension, forgave her, saying that we all make mistakes and that this is an inevitable part of life that everyone has to face, no matter how much we try to avoid them. He then stood up, adding that people were made to make mistakes and that it was an integral part of their nature, but his forced smile could hardly hide the deep scars that remained in his soul, reminding him of pain and experience. Suddenly, the guy, grabbing her hand, expressed the hope that the lady would not blame him for the mistake, which caused bewilderment and surprise on the face of the magnificent beauty. The woman's eyes widened and she could not understand why he said so. As if losing his mind, Romeo admitted that he really thought they could fall in love, but now it became clear to him that Juliet was just playing with his feelings, fooling him, and had no serious intentions. Roughly and without warning, the handsome man squeezed his companion's hand. His grip was relentless, and something flashed in his eyes that made her heart beat faster, realizing that the threats might not be empty. Without thinking twice, Juliet turned around sharply and tried to run away, hoping for speed, but Romeo, not giving her a chance, tightly squeezed her wrist. His fingers literally dug into her skin, not allowing her to take a single step further. Covering her mouth with his hand to prevent her from objecting, the man coldly added that his character had always been such. He knew no half measures and was ready to give everything he had, doubly so, regardless of the circumstances and consequences. From afar, Romeo's friends appeared, rushing in search of Montague's anxiously and urgently, as if they were trying to find him at the very end of the road, ready to face any difficulties, if only to return with important news or a solution. Still holding the lady in his arms, the young man greeted his acquaintances with an unperturbed expression on his face, as if he did not notice the tension that was in the air, and as if their presence did not cause him the slightest concern. Benvolio, noticing the situation, anxiously ordered his relative to immediately let the beauty go, and not to do anything stupid, but for Romeo, it did not seem to matter, as if he was in his own world, far from other people's warnings. With a forced smile that barely hid his inner irritation, Romeo muttered quietly that he and the girl needed to sort out a few important issues first, before moving forward, a veiled threat in his voice. The lady stood there trembling with fear, unable to move, her body motionless, as if paralyzed in the rigid grip of her companion, and every muscle resisting, but she could not move under his inexorable control. Tybalt sat on the steps, deep in thought about his life, about what was happening in his destiny, and about how his cousin was increasingly becoming a part of his thoughts, causing strange, unfamiliar feelings. He remembered how Romeo had been eavesdropping on their conversation, hiding in the shadows, and how at that moment his behavior had seemed strange and suspicious. But then suddenly, the young man had taken off running, leaving no trace, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Juliet was deeply shocked and completely confused because she realized that the young man had found out about their secret plan, and now, after all the effort she had made, everything was in vain, and her hopes were dashed, leaving only a feeling of emptiness and disappointment. Tybalt, with despair in his voice, shouted that he was ready to help her, if only she asked, not paying attention to the possible consequences and difficulties, ready to give everything for her well-being and be there when she needed it. But the lady only ordered the guy not to take any action, but to just sit and wait for her return, leaving him confused and completely unaware of what was happening, without any hope for a change in the situation. The man wearily buried his face in his hands, feeling a painful disappointment, realizing that despite all his efforts, he could not help his cousin in any way, and his helplessness tormented his soul, leaving only a feeling of guilt. The young man, absorbed in sad thoughts, reflected that perhaps if he had known about all the events from the very beginning, many things could have turned out differently, and they could have avoided those terrible consequences that now seemed inevitable. The other guys standing nearby condemned Romeo for his actions, believing that he was only bringing trouble not only to his own family, but also creating problems for Benvolio, who had to deal with the consequences of his reckless actions. Tybalt was very angry when he heard the words that Montagues, when he had played enough with Juliet, would switch to another lady, and this thought deeply affected him, filling his heart with anger and determination to do something about it without thinking about the consequences. The young men, trying to calm their brother, reminded him that Juliet was the heiress of Capulet, and therefore could not be touched or insulted, since her name and honor demanded respect, and interference could lead to disastrous consequences. Benvolio, appealing to his relative with a call to common sense, persuaded him that they should not attract unnecessary attention to themselves, because such open aggression could only aggravate the situation and lead to even greater problems. Coldly, with icy calm, Romeo stated that back then he simply had to convince himself that no one would hear the beauty's voice, and if they were not discovered, everything would be fine, as if everything that was happening did not matter, and would not lead to unpleasant consequences. The man, without wasting time, tried to knock the lady out with one blow to the back of the neck, hoping that this would quickly and quietly solve the problem, leaving her in a helpless state and ensuring his own safety. The beauty, having lost consciousness from the blow, fell to the ground, her body unconsciously leaning under the feet of the guy who stood motionless, and felt how the situation was taking an unexpected turn from which it was no longer possible to retreat. Then Benvolio, unable to bear it any longer, went up to the lovely Romeo and gave him a hard slap in the face, trying to bring him back to reality, reminding him that acting so recklessly was not a way out or a solution, but only a path to disaster. The man, shaking with rage, shouted that his brother had apparently lost his mind and stopped thinking sensibly, not realizing the extent of the risk he was taking, not realizing that all this would lead to catastrophic consequences. Romeo, stepping back and looking at Benvolio in shock, did not understand why exactly he had been hit in the cheek. He was at a loss, not realizing that his actions and words had offended his loved one so much that he had decided to act like that. The man stepped back and asked his interlocutor something important, since Montagues was not always the one who started the conflict, and sometimes the circumstances could be completely different than they seemed at first glance. Benvolio listened silently to the words of his interlocutor, feeling how he was gradually losing his mind and becoming more and more immersed in his crazy thoughts, forgetting about the essence of what was happening and the importance of self-control in difficult situations. With a nasty grin on his face, Romeo, as if playing with Benvolio, asked him to admit that he always wanted Montagues to be the cause of all the problems, because it was easier to blame someone else than to look for the real reasons and mistakes. The girl lay unconscious on the grass, her body motionless, as if she had fallen into a deep sleep, unaware of what was happening around her, unconscious in that moment when everything around her was changing. The night was surrounded by darkness, the trees stood in the shadows, the darkness was hidden and not a single light illuminated this restless emptiness, and the coolness that permeated the air made one feel even more vulnerable and lonely. Clenching his hands into fists, the man looked at his brother with determination in his eyes and asked him to be honest, to admit to himself what was happening, and to understand that true feelings and actions cannot be hidden even if you really wanted to. In the past, beaten and depressed, Romeo sat on his knees, his ears ringing with the screams and curses coming from the outside, as if the world around him was collapsing, and he could not escape this circle of pain and humiliation. However, Benvolio did not feel any excitement. On the contrary, there was a strange smile on his face, as if he was enjoying what was happening, finding in it his inner resilience and perhaps some hidden meaning that was unknown to Romeo. The young man who was watching his relative from the side could not understand such a reaction because there was nothing good in what was happening, and it seemed to him that this was all just a product of chaos and pain which could not lead to anything positive. The man putting his hand on his interlocutor's shoulder interrupted his speech as if trying to stop the flow of words and make it clear that what was important now was not what was being said, but what was happening inside each of them in their souls and in their understanding of the situation. Touched and disappointed, Benvolio could not believe that his loved one really thought so badly of him, that he saw him as something other than what he really was, and this thought painfully pierced his heart, depriving him of confidence. Recoiling in confusion, dear Romeo asked why his relative had been behaving so strangely and mysteriously all this time, since his actions and words remained contradictory, and this only increased the misunderstanding between them. The boys' conversation was interrupted by a strange voice which suddenly caught their attention, making them freeze in place and realize that they now had to face something much more serious. It was the handsome Tybalt, breathing heavily and clearly shaken, his gaze burning with anger, and the fear for his beloved cousin was visible in his eyes as he asked where the noblewoman was not hiding his excitement and tension. The young men, looking at each other in confusion, suddenly froze, not knowing how to answer because confusion and indecision had completely taken hold of them, depriving them of the opportunity to find even one correct word to explain what was happening and dispel the anxiety that had arisen in the air. When Tybalt noticed the sleeping maiden's body lying at their feet, he cursed, his face contorted with rage, and the hatred in his voice was so strong that he swore to take revenge on them for what had happened, promising that no one would escape punishment and that they would all pay for it. The nobleman, unable to contain his anger, grabbed Romeo by the shirt, shouting with fury in his voice that he dared to hurt his relative, as if every word was filled with hatred and a desire to avenge the honor of his family. The swordsman loudly declared that Romeo would have to answer for his actions right now without waiting for any explanations or justifications, because it was a matter of honor and he was ready to fight to restore justice. Unimpressed, Romeo challenged him by asking if it wasn't the two of them who had gone too far first, if they hadn't tried to set Montagues up and make him look like a fool, as if forgetting that they too bore their share of responsibility for everything that was happening. Tybalt, without thinking about the consequences, slapped his interlocutor in a rage without holding back, and not expecting that it would remain unanswered, because his anger was so great that he was ready to go to extreme measures. Romeo, without losing his composure, responded in kind, and gritting his teeth struck back at the swordsman, deciding that he would not allow himself to be humiliated and would not allow either of them to feel like winners in this conflict. Juliet lay unconscious as if she were sleeping, her body motionless, and her eyes closed, unaware of what was happening around her, immersed in a state that left her outside of all this chaos and struggle. The Montagues' friends were startled, unsure of how to act in such a tense situation, because each of them felt that what was happening went beyond the usual conflict, and now they had to make a decision that could change everything. Gently, despite his blazing anger, Tybalt carefully picked up his beloved, trying to carry her away from the scene, trying not to disturb her peace, and at the same time not knowing what to do next, because his heart was full of fear for her condition. But Romeo wasn't going to stand aside. Anger was boiling in his veins, his teeth were clenched with tension, and his eyes were burning with determination. He was ready for any turn of events, firmly determined that he would not allow himself to be ignored at this decisive moment. The man addressed the swordsman, demanding that he not ignore him or avoid the conversation. His voice was sharp and firm, like a cold threat, and he was sure that his words could not go unnoticed and should be taken seriously. Suddenly there was a blow, and Romeo, unable to stand, began to fall backwards, his body not able to withstand the force of the blow he faced, and at that moment everything around him seemed to slow down, as if reflecting his internal struggle and shock from what was happening. Benvolio looked angrily at the scoundrel who dared to hit his relative and rudely call all Montagues cowards, not understanding how it was possible to humiliate the honor of his family in such a way as if forgetting about his own dignity and respect. The young men heard that instead of holding Cousin Capulet hostage, it would be much better for them to directly challenge them to a duel openly and honestly, without these hidden threats and manipulations that only complicated the situation. Tybalt frowned and shouted loudly for them to try to behave decently, his voice full of disdain and self-righteousness, as if demanding that everyone not only follow the rules, but also show great respect for himself. Benvolio rose to his feet, resolutely taking the sword in his hand, and proudly said that he was ready to fight with the best swordsman in their city, not wanting to give in to this duel which had become for him a matter of honor and personal dignity. A sword was thrown at Capulet's feet, and sounding like a call to battle, his thrust marked the beginning of a decisive battle in which there would be no room for weakness, and only he who showed all his determination would emerge victorious. The glint of the blade was reflected in the guy's eyes, and looking at him one could feel his danger because he was ready for any threat and was not going to stop until he achieved his goal in this brutal duel. Benvolio briefly noted that Tybalt looked surprised, and this was quite natural, for he could not have expected that his confidence in his own strength would be met with such a decisive opposition that it made him doubt. The other man standing nearby pulled out a sharp dagger, ready to intervene, his gaze full of determination, and he was ready to act despite all the dangers to help his comrade in this difficult and tense moment. He wanted to sneak up behind Capulet to deliver a decisive blow in the back, counting on the moment when the enemy would be completely unprepared, but at that moment everything did not go as he expected, and his plans encountered unexpected obstacles. As Romeo suddenly woke up, his eyes began to blink rapidly, trying to adjust to the darkness and return to reality after consciousness slowly returned to him, pulling him out of his daze. The first thing he noticed was Benvolio, standing with a blade in the shadows of the night, his silhouette sharp and determined, and Romeo felt his heart skip a beat in his chest, realizing that the situation was far more serious than he could have imagined. And after he tried to act, Romeo noticed Tybalt standing nearby, and the two men were clearly preparing for a fight, their eyes full of determination and anger, as if they were already anticipating the inevitable conflict that was about to break out. Behind the swordsman, the best in the city, stood a scoundrel who was about to strike from the side, hiding in the darkness, ready to use betrayal as a weapon to achieve his goal at this decisive moment. The blade was driven into Capulet's back, and the blood flowed out, drenching the ground like a harbinger of imminent tragedy, giving the cruel scene an even darker hue, while its aftermath unfolded in silence, permeated with horror and helplessness. Tybalt was shocked that the Montagues were cowards who could not act honestly, and this act left him in disarray, destroying all his notions of honor and dignity of his opponents. Suddenly, Romeo jumped up from his place, and without thinking about the consequences, rushed at Capulet, sharply pressing on his chest and pushing him back, forcing the blade to go deeper, giving the blow deadly force. Tybalt coughed up blood, his body shook from unbearable pain, and in the depths of his mind, alarm signals of fear began to ring, unable to accept that everything was so quickly getting out of control, slipping from his hands like sand. Young Tybalt felt his body falling heavily and helplessly to the ground, and Romeo fell on top of him, his figure implacable and determined, a symbol of a desperate desire to resolve all contradictions once and for all, leaving no room for doubt. Benvolio and the other boy closed their mouths in surprise, in complete shock at the act of their friend who, despite his rage and desire for revenge, was himself wounded, and concern for his life appeared in their eyes, as if they realized for the first time the full gravity of what was happening. Screams pierced the night, echoing through the dark streets, as the boys, unsure of what to do, tried to save the Montagues' heir from death, desperate to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling out from under them. At that moment, Juliet woke up, not understanding what was happening. Her eyes were trying to focus, and her body slowly rose while her mind could not yet understand exactly what brought her to this moment, full of fear and bewilderment. Suddenly, her gaze fell on her hand, and she noticed that it was stained with blood, cold and sticky, and at that moment, anxiety like a shadow crept into her heart, like a harbinger of inevitable trouble which did not leave her accumulating fear. As if realizing the full depth of what was happening, she slowly turned around and saw Tybalt lying next to her, motionless as if dead, and this picture shook her to the depths of her soul, causing her heart to squeeze with pain and fear of the inevitable. The man was barely breathing, coughing heavily, blood was pouring out of his stomach, and the blade was piercing deep into his body, giving his torment an inevitable and painful end. His life was fading quickly like a dim fire, unable to resist the winds of fate. He stared blankly into space, as if he saw no point in what was happening, gradually realizing that these were his last minutes in this world, and nothing could bring him back to reality, carrying him further and further into the abyss. Tybalt noticed that the lady was leaning over him, and with surprise he realized that she cared, that her heart, despite everything that was happening, was attached to him despite his cruelty and pride. Tears slowly flowed down the beauty's eyes, each of which like a heavy drop rolled down her face, leaving traces of bitterness and pain that could be compared to invisible wounds, tormenting her soul and not giving her a moment of peace. The noble woman sobbed loudly, screaming that this was not what she wanted, that everything had not gone as she expected, and now her world was collapsing in the blink of an eye as the night fell silent, and they were left alone with no one else around. The beauty cried, tired tears rolling down her cheeks, because she could no longer bear the sight of her loved ones leaving dying before her eyes, and every moment brought only more pain. Tybalt watched her helplessly, unable to console her, his heart aching with hopelessness as her tears fell on his face, and he felt how hard it was for him to watch her suffer. He reached out his hand to her black hair, gently brushing the strands from her face, as if trying to ease the weight of her suffering a little, and perhaps find some comfort for her and for himself in this simple gesture. He said tenderly that the noble woman looked incredibly tired, her eyes expressed deep anxiety and sadness, and it was probably extremely difficult for her because the inner experiences hidden behind her external fortitude desperately demanded an outlet. With his last breath, the man, coughing with difficulty, could barely utter the words that Juliet had always been special to him, that she was not someone else's, and in this realization, he understood how much he had been wrong in giving his heart to others. Grabbing the blade with his hand, the man felt his life leaving, but despite the bleeding, he still said that his most precious memories were connected with her, because it was with her, the lady, that he spent his entire childhood and youth, and these moments will forever remain in his soul. The guy, with a barely noticeable smile on his face, feeling his strength fading, added affectionately that he would not want to return his Juliet because she was right in front of him, and at that moment he realized that there was nothing more important to him than her. The beauty, unable to hold back her tears, felt the heaviness in her heart becoming unbearable, her eyes full of pain and bitterness, and with her teeth unable to cope with her emotions, she bit her lip, trying to hide her mental anguish. The man, feeling his strength fading carefully, placed his hand on the beauty's palm with a barely noticeable tremor in his voice, asking her not to cry and not to be tormented by bitterness because he did not want her heart to break from pain. But despite his last attempts to console her, his strength left him, and the hand that had so tenderly held her palm began to fall slowly as if everything that was left to him had been exhausted in this last bitter moment. The aristocrat, despite what was happening, desperately refused to let him go to another world. Her voice, full of pain and fear, sounded like a plea, as if she could stop time asking him to stay here with her in this world. The man's hand lay limply on the soft grass, his body no longer responding to her touch, and his breathing was becoming weaker and weaker, reminding her how close their loss had been, and how difficult it was to accept the inevitability. Without thinking, her gaze, filled with determination and despair, fell on the dagger she clutched in her hand, and with painful determination, she raised it to start this cycle of pain and fear again, unable to stop her impulse. She took one last look at the quiet boy who was lying peacefully on the ground, his eyes closed and his body lifeless like a shadow that had disappeared, leaving only the pain and bitterness of loss filling her heart. After that, her hand, trembling with excitement, pointed the blade towards herself as if she was trying to regain control, but she understood that there was no way back, and all she had left was to take this step that would take her soul. Blinking again, she quietly said that she and Tybalt would meet again soon, her voice hopeful, as if she was trying to find comfort in the words, despite the pain that tormented her soul. But the next moment she fell unconscious, her body became heavy, and her consciousness faded, and the blood slowly flowing filled the ground, leaving behind an indelible trace of the tragedy that no one could prevent. It was a long road for the maiden, and she found it difficult to make friends because her heart was so closed that it was difficult to trust anyone, even in moments when she so desperately wanted to find support. Juliet, enjoying her walk in her new elegant blue dress that emphasized her grace, and with her neat hairdo as if created for this special day, suddenly heard a familiar voice calling her by name. She noticed the woman offering her hot buns. The aroma of freshly baked goods that wafted through the air was so enticing that Juliet couldn't resist moving closer to take a closer look at the treat. The woman was sweet-freckled, and her good-natured face glowed with friendliness. Even though she was only a minor character in this moment, her gesture left behind a feeling of warmth and care that Juliet received with gratitude. The lady, without hesitation, agreed to accept the offer because this aunt was always there supporting and comforting her in the most difficult moments when Juliet felt lonely and abandoned. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected encounter. A young guy with golden hair like a luminous beam approached her, attracting her attention. Bright hair shone in the sun, creating the impression that he was as if the embodiment of the sun's rays themselves. With a slight smile, Juliet, somewhat worried, quietly asked what had happened to her dear Romeo, for his behavior, which had suddenly become rude and full of anxiety, could not help but make her uneasy, making her heart clench. The man bowed his head, holding back tears with difficulty, and his voice trembled with pain as he cruelly replied that she should get out of his way, not interfere, and that her presence only aggravated his suffering. But Tybalt was always next to the girl, who, putting his hand on her shoulder, gently assured her that she should not worry, because he would always be there, and everything would definitely work out, despite the difficulties and worries that they were experiencing. The aristocrat could not hold back his tears. His gaze was full of furious hatred and deep resentment, as if he was on the verge of internal destruction, and the pain that had been accumulating in his soul spilled out, distorting his features. Just as the silence between them deepened, a loud, shrill voice rang out, inexorably interrupting their conversation, informing them that urgent news had arrived for Tybalt that required immediate attention. The nanny, choking with emotion, shouted loudly and desperately that Romeo, a representative of the Montagues family, had just committed suicide, and these words seemed to break the atmosphere, leaving everyone in shock and deep horror. Juliet winced in shock when she heard that her lover Romeo had jumped off the cliff, and her heart sank with pain and fear, unable to believe such a tragedy that shook her to the depths of her soul. Tybalt, not hiding his irritation, called the man a moron, condemning his actions, and showing obvious contempt for his decision, suggesting that his cousin go out and get some fresh air to calm down a little. The guy, feeling that he needed to somehow console Juliet, suggested that the next day they go visit Romeo to check on his condition and honor the memory of the deceased, despite the tragedy of the situation. But Juliet, deciding not to waste time on regrets, jumped from the balcony hoping that she could start all over again, regain control of her life, despite all the trials and tragedies that surrounded her. When she opened her eyes, she found herself awake in her bed, just like before, and the whole world seemed the same as it had been before her life changed, leaving only the memories of what had happened. The girl could not understand what exactly had happened, not realizing what she had done, but perhaps it was just her desire to start from scratch. The aristocrat decided that this day would begin with the usual purchase of bread to get back on track. At that moment, the creaking of the old door was heard in the silence, and it opened as if waiting for her return, as always in that very familiar and cozy corner of the store, which had long become a place of comfort for her. The saleswoman greeted Juliet with a friendly smile, and looking at her asked how exactly she could help, this time offering her services as always with a warm and attentive attitude. When Juliet entered the store, she was a little confused, noticing that the woman she knew, whom she often saw here, was no longer present in her usual place, and this slightly confused her, creating a feeling of uncertainty. The woman answered Juliet's question with a slight smile, explaining that the old saleswoman with freckles had not worked there for a long time, and that she herself had been baking for 10 years, maintaining the traditions of the store that she once loved so much. At that moment, Juliet shuddered, and suddenly it became clear to her that something in this place had changed, as if reality itself had adjusted a new scenario for itself, and she found herself at the very center of this mystical change. Frightened and confused, the girl hurriedly left the store, feeling as if she was losing a part of herself, and the memories that were once clear and unshakable suddenly dissolved, as did her place in this world after she returned to life. The lady, almost exhausted by grief, collapsed to the ground, barely holding back her tears, realizing that she had to fight this world alone without anyone to support her in this endless struggle. Through the fog of confusion and fear, Juliet could not contain her emotions, and large tears slowly rolled down her cheeks as a symbol of the hopelessness that engulfed her soul at that moment. The aristocrat clutched the piece of paper in her hands, almost forgetting who she was in her past life, but despite this, a strange desire to return to the world that was once her home, her presence still glimmered in her heart. Juliet raised her head and tried to gather her strength, saying words of comfort to herself out loud that everything would definitely become clear as soon as she returned to her home world, and then everything that had happened would make sense. After this, Juliet began to keep careful records, recording every detail of what was happening, because she was afraid of losing her memories, trying to keep at least a small part of what remained in her head. The lady, who had already despaired and lost all hope, suddenly met someone who behaved completely differently, and this person turned out to be Tybalt, whose actions were full of determination and unexpected strength. At that moment, the swordsman rushed forward, not paying attention to the road, as if pursuing some unknown goal, driven only by an inner impulse that led him forward without looking back. Juliet, watching him, quickly noticed that there was no pre-written destiny behind this act, but only his own will, his personal desire, which did not yield to any external laws or scenarios. The endless returns to life gave her a unique opportunity to observe the characters, their actions, and reveal their true essences, diving into the depths of their psychological world and trying to understand who they really were. Most of the characters, following their assigned roles, acted strictly in accordance with what was intended for them, without going beyond the script that was written for them from the very beginning. Tybalt was added to the book for the sole purpose of protecting his cousin, following a clearly written role, but unexpectedly for everyone he decided to defy his destiny, going against the predetermined path that was given to him. His stone figure, which seemed motionless and lifeless, suddenly seemed to collapse, and in that moment, Tybalt found his own will freeing himself from the chains of a pre-written fate. The noblewoman, confidently striding across the courtyard, moved forward, hoping that her plan at the ball would come true and everything would go as she had planned, despite all the obstacles and possible surprises that could arise at the most unexpected moment. She looked blankly at her cousin, who needed to be greeted as usual, but all this tired her so much that she could barely contain her irritation, not understanding why she had to repeat this ritual again. Juliet smiled broadly, trying to hide her displeasure, and with a slightly strained expression on her face, greeted her cousin, trying to do it as formally as possible so as not to reveal her true feelings. However, Tybalt, noticing her look, quickly apologized to his relative, adding that he was too busy to devote time to her, and his words sounded with notes of sincere regret that he could not be there as usual. In shock, the beauty stood for a few seconds, unable to move, and then for a moment it seemed to her that she had finally found her way out of the endless labyrinth into which she had driven herself. After reading her notes, the lady came to the realization that Tybalt had always been there for his cousin, supported her, and helped her in the most difficult situations, becoming an integral part of her life, although she had not noticed it until now, remaining blind to his devotion. Juliet realized that all this time she had not given due importance to the important fact that she had a relative who always stood behind her, ready to protect her in any situation, without asking unnecessary questions and without expecting gratitude or anything in return. She also remembered that in the original, Tybalt was destined to meet his fate in a battle with Romeo, where he was supposed to die giving his life in battle, and this became part of his inevitable path in this story. Looking at her notes, Juliet couldn't understand what had changed and why Tybalt had started to behave completely differently, as if something had suddenly turned inside him and he had become unrecognizable, distorted by his own pain. Meanwhile, a man's voice, trembling, penetrated the glass, and beads of sweat appeared on Juliet's face like traces of internal tension, creating the feeling that something important was about to happen, as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation. Clutching the papers in her hands, the girl tried to remember how her last attempt to find a solution ended, to find even the slightest hope for a happy outcome, but the memories did not come to her clearly, like a fog hiding the truth. Eventually, by the evening, Juliet realized that Tybalt was worried about accidentally killing Romeo, and had returned to that moment, just like her, realizing that their destinies were intertwined in a tragedy that could not be avoided. Running her finger across her lip, the lady came to an important and unexpected conclusion, which until that moment seemed difficult for her to comprehend. But now everything fell into place and she was ready to act, following her inner voice. Taking a tray of dishes in her hands, Juliet decided to go and visit her relative, feeling that this step was important for her, and the need to communicate with him arose as something that could bring peace back to her soul. All the characters returning in time lost their memories, as if their past was erased, leaving only vague fragments, but the main character herself, fortunately or unfortunately, managed to preserve the memories of the past that she could not forget. But Tybalt became an exception to this rule, as he did not lose his memory of the events that happened before returning in time, and continued to remember everything as if time could not erase a single important moment from his life. The beauty stood frozen at the door, deep in thought, trying to understand whether Tybalt was dying in the same way as she was, or whether their destinies were intertwined in some other, more mysterious way that she could not immediately comprehend despite all her efforts. She was afraid that the man might have come into this world the same way she had, having experienced something similar, lost all memories of his past life, and was now trapped in his new existence just like she was. The lady, feeling that she could wait no longer, resolutely asked the nobleman to let her into the house, hoping that here she would find answers to her questions and perhaps salvation from the doubts that tormented her heart. The man, without thinking for long, easily opened the door, letting her into the house and giving her a feeling of confidence that she was not alone in this strange world full of secrets and mysteries that she had to solve, allowed her to feel support and hope. Now, observing the heart of her swordsman, she realized her mistake, realizing that she should not have seen him as just a means to an end, without taking into account all the sacrifices and efforts he had put into her life and all that he had done for her. After all, the young man always protected her, invariably stood on her side regardless of the situation, demonstrating his devotion and willingness to fight for her despite any obstacles that stood in the way. He constantly, despite his pride, scolded the stupid Romeo for how frivolously and unworthily he treated his relative, not understanding how important it is to protect the honor and dignity of loved ones, especially when it came to family to which one had to be devoted. And even on the brink of death, brave Tybalt managed to find the strength to smile and support his sweet lady, showing that his feelings and affection were deep despite all the trials that befell him. The beauty hastily asked the guy to wait so that she could fix everything and sort out the situation, hoping that time would give her the opportunity to put everything back in its place and eliminate all the consequences of her decisions. The swordsman woke up on his bed, and as soon as he opened his eyes, he felt a heaviness in his heart, as if his thoughts could not be collected together, not understanding what was happening around him. There was confusion in his head that demanded an immediate solution. Sitting up in bed, the man quickly began to look around as if expecting to see something familiar, trying to understand where he was and how he ended up in this place. Everything around him seemed alien, and memories were difficult to come by. He grabbed his forehead with his hand, feeling a strong headache, as if his memory was trying to awaken through a thick fog, but each attempt only increased the pain, making him feel lost, confused, and completely out of touch with reality. Tybalt's hands began to try to remember, feeling that he had forgotten something extremely important, as if part of his memories were slipping away, and his mind could not grasp this elusive fragment, unable to understand what exactly was bothering him and disturbing his soul. Stepping out onto the training field, the man struck the target mercilessly, making powerful swings as if wanting to vent all his uncertainty and confusion that had gripped his heart, forcing him to act without any thought. The boy pierced the hay dummy with his blade, striking with precision, demonstrating skill and strength, but at that moment he felt his memory fail him, as if everything he had done was just part of a vague and distorted memory. He stopped abruptly in his tracks, as a new hallucination appeared before him, and everything around him began to distort, filling his inner world with chaos. The man did not know what to do, his memory seemed to be breaking, and he did not know what to believe. Tybalt decided to continue walking through the yard, deciding that perhaps he could skip training today due to feeling unwell, as his mind and body could not take the stress any longer, and he needed time to sort himself out. Suddenly, Tybalt jumped as Juliet unexpectedly hugged him from behind, her smile so warm and genuine that it seemed like a source of comfort, as if she wanted to give him some peace in the chaos that was tearing his mind apart. A new hallucination appeared before him in which his cousin, covered in blood, lay motionless, as if she could no longer fight what was happening, and this sight struck Tybalt to the depths of his soul, causing him to freeze. The noblewoman, surprised by his reaction, turned to her relative with alarm, trying to understand what had happened, but before she could finish speaking, Tybalt pushed her aside sharply, as if everything he had seen had become too much for him to bear. The man, clutching his hair in an attempt to control himself, closed his eyes, trying to calm down. He apologized to the noblewoman for his rudeness, realizing how strange and painful he was acting, not wanting his storm of emotions to hurt her. In response, the noblewoman heard the man say that, for some reason, he felt uncomfortable in her presence, as if something inside him prevented him from communicating normally with her, and this uncomfortable situation remained between them like an invisible barrier. This feeling was especially strong against the backdrop of good weather, when the trees with their green canopy created a calm atmosphere, but inside the sweet Tybalt there was anxiety, as if nature was at odds with his state of mind. The boy turned away and was about to leave, but a woman's hand reached out to him, stopping him, and the noblewoman asked with concern if he needed medicine or the help of a doctor, showing concern and a desire to help despite his detachment. But Tybalt only roughly pushed the noblewoman away from him, causing her hand to slip and fall from his body, as if his inner world was unable to withstand her closeness, and he did not know how to cope with the growing tension that was tearing him apart from within. The lady hugged the red hand, feeling the throbbing pain from his gesture, which left not only a physical mark, but also deeply wounded her soul, because she did not expect this from a man to whom she treated with care and understanding. However, Tybalt hurried to run away, feeling an urgent need to be alone with himself, hoping that loneliness would help him sort out his thoughts and at least slightly calm the storm of emotions that was tearing him apart from the inside, not giving him peace. The maiden, however, was not going to give in so easily. She stood before him with a determined frown, her eyes sparkling with determination, as if she was ready to fight for his attention, not letting him leave without letting him help her. She stubbornly followed her relative, not letting him leave, holding his hand tightly, as if she felt that this moment was important and could not let him just disappear, leaving everything in the past, as if nothing had happened. Strong Tybalt, with despair in his voice, plaintively asked the aristocrat to let him go and let him leave in peace, hoping that she would understand how hard it was for him and how much he needed to be alone to survive this internal conflict. But the beauty was not going to let him go, and firmly asked if the man had really remembered something, as if believing that right now he could understand and realize something important that would help him get out of the state he found himself in. Tybalt, in complete shock, recoiled, unable to believe that Juliet was willing to help him, as if her determination was something unexpected and unimaginable to him in this state, as if he did not deserve her attention and care. But then the same intense pain in his head came again, and he, unable to restrain himself, grabbed his head with his hand, feeling how his body was again seized by this painful attack, and he again found himself on the verge of losing consciousness. The young man looked at his hands in horror, realizing that he had seen hallucinations of people dying, and each of these visions brought with it pain and anxiety, as if his mind could not cope with what was happening. Moreover, every time he encountered these terrible visions, it was Juliet who died covered in blood, her hand reaching out to him as a symbol of the inevitable tragedy that he could not avoid, and each time it shook him even more. Tybalt held back the urge to vomit with his hand over his mouth, feeling his body as if it had betrayed him, refusing to obey, and with each passing moment he felt worse, as if his inner world was about to collapse into complete destruction. The guy, struggling with his inner demons, suddenly started running, unable to stay near the girl, fearing that his presence would bring her pain, and feeling how the storm of emotions tearing apart his soul did not give him peace, preventing him from making the right decision. He grabbed the wall with his hand and tried to keep his balance so as not to fall, feeling his strength leaving him, and the only thing left for him was to fight for at least a minimal sense of control over himself. Juliet stubbornly followed him, breathing heavily, her body filled with tension, but she did not stop trying to understand what was happening to him, unable to leave him in this state despite her own fatigue and pain. Frowning, the beauty added that everything he saw was probably true, events from their past lives, and that explained all the tormenting visions he was experiencing as something inevitable that they had to face. The lady asked that the brave Tybalt listen to her calmly, at least once, without avoiding her words and feelings, understanding how important it was at such moments to be heard, especially when their lives were intertwined so closely that every word could change everything. Bowing her head, she admitted that there had been dozens of attempts to get out of this hell before, but none of them had brought the long-awaited peace, and now she knew that the only way to find a way out was together, despite all the obstacles. And then, holding her head high, Juliet added that she herself had died hundreds of times, experiencing the same pain as he did, and that these sufferings were part of their shared lives, like an inevitable fate that haunted them again and again. The noblewoman extended her hand forward, ready not only to support, but also to help her relative, demonstrating her unwavering determination and desire to find a way out of this tangled labyrinth that seemed to squeeze them. Then, without hesitation, she pulled the blade from its sheath as if ready to fight not only external enemies but also those demons that tormented their souls, hoping that this step would bring them strength and confidence in their further path. The beauty raised her hand with the sword up, cutting through the air, as if preparing for a decisive step that was supposed to change something in their difficult situation. The noblewoman held her breath, full of confidence in her action. With a determination that was reflected in her every movement, she cut the fabric of her green dress, and for a moment silence enveloped them, as if this gesture became a symbol of the fact that she was ready to reveal to him everything that she had long hidden behind an outer appearance filled with secrets. Frightened, Tybalt screamed loudly, asking what the beauty was doing, panicking that she might get hurt, not knowing how to react to her unexpected and risky behavior, which worried his fragile soul. It turned out that she had torn her dress to show him her scars, the marks of her previous lives that remained on her body, a reminder of the suffering and trials they had gone through and that were still with them. Dark, heavy clouds gathering in the sky obscured the light. Everything around was swallowed up by grayness, and a premonition of rain hung in the air, as if nature itself sensed that something important and inevitable was approaching, something that must certainly happen. As the rain began to fall, the beauty lowered her hands, and despite the raindrops, her voice sounded confident and filled with strength. The beauty said that Tybalt was truly special, as the one who managed to awaken something forgotten and hidden deep in her soul. The sweet noblewoman could not hold back her tears, she cried, but these tears were not from grief, but from relief, because she had finally found a person, a ray of sunshine in this hell, and now she was sure that she was not alone in her suffering, that there was someone who shared her pain. The man listened to the noblewoman's speech in shock, realizing how much time and effort she had put into searching for him, how many sacrifices and fears she had endured in order to finally find him. Such words filled with pain and sincerity seemed to shake him to the depths of his soul. Wiping away her tears with her hand, the lady added that he was more precious to her than anything she had ever gone through, and even in the darkest moments of her life, she continued to believe that she would find him, because she could not allow herself to forget him. The guy listened attentively to every word of the lady opposite him, feeling how her sincere and deep words penetrated into his very soul, as if she was trying to awaken something forgotten, which had long eclipsed his mind and feelings, as if opening long-closed doors for him. Stubbornly grasping the blade, Juliet made a firm decision. She would not let him go, would not let him miss her chance, deciding to fight to the end, to return his memory despite all the obstacles and difficulties that she would have to overcome. Pointing the blade in front of her, Juliet promised to do everything in her power to get Tybalt's memories back, and was ready to fight any obstacles, not allowing doubts and fear to stop her on this difficult path. The beauty suddenly began to attack her relative, waving her weapon with such determination that it became clear that she was ready to go to the end, despite all the risks, to help him find his way in this confusing world. The nobleman dodged the blows, not understanding when the beauty learned to handle the sword so masterfully. His gaze darted around, trying to find answers to all the questions she asked him, but he still couldn't understand what was happening. Finally, Tybalt found himself pinned against the wall, and the blade slammed into the stone next to him with a loud sound, creating a final barrier, leaving him no escape route, as if everything around him had been locked into this insurmountable situation. Crying in the rain, Juliet begged him to remember trying to reach his memory, because she believed that inside him there was still the person who was so dear to her, and she was ready to go through everything to get him back. The young man bowed his head down in silence, lost in his thoughts, feeling pain and helplessness. He didn't know what to do with what was happening, and despite her words, he continued to be captivated by his own doubts and vague memories. The aristocrat's flowing dress dragged along the grass, as if nature itself felt the weight of her thoughts. Her determination to help Tybalt return to himself, to awaken the forgotten past that seemed to be slipping further and further from his consciousness. The beauty thought about how she could help him remember, how she could take him back to the moments they had shared together. A flash of insight came into her eyes, and finally she came up with a way that could jog his memory. She gripped the weapon tighter, bringing it to her face, and her gaze became even more determined. In that moment, she was ready to do anything to make him remember and believe that their connection was not an accident, but something much more significant and inevitable. At that moment, Tybalt shuddered, and fear passed through his body, as if an inner premonition told him that something important and painful was about to happen, and his fear only grew stronger because he could not understand what exactly was frightening him. The man's hand reached forward without thinking, as if instinct told Tybalt that he had to save her, to prevent the step she was about to take to keep her from hurting herself, even if it meant going against her resolve. Gently, with a soft sigh, Tybalt embraced the beautiful noblewoman, holding the lady close in comfort, as if to let her know that she was not alone, that he was there, and that there was room in their lives not only for pain, but also for hope and support. The guy looked at sweet Juliet with concern, anxiously trying to understand if everything was okay with her. The man's gaze was full of excitement. He could not take his eyes off her wounded body, trying to find at least the slightest sign of her condition. His hand was covered in blood, as if the marks of a terrible struggle left on her skin were a reminder of what they had been through together, and he was haunted by the thought of how dangerous all of this was for her. And then suddenly, the man remembered one moment from their past. A meeting with a girl when the dishes accidentally broke. The sound of breaking porcelain echoed in his memory like a warning that not everything is as simple as it seemed at first glance. He clearly remembered her request when, with eyes full of hope and anxiety, she begged him to help her in an important matter that seemed urgent and required his participation, as if without him everything could fall apart and lead to disaster. And also how large tears like streams rolled down her cheeks when the girl sobbed, not holding back her emotions, grieving and worrying for him at that moment. The memory returned to his mind with such clarity that he could not help but feel pain in his heart. Tybalt remembered it all with stunning clarity, the look in her eyes full of pain and anxiety, her desire to understand what was happening, and the moment of recognition when their eyes met, and he felt something important and inexpressible pass between them. Suddenly unable to contain his emotions, he hugged his cousin tightly, completely, forgetting that she still had the tip of the blade in her hands, threateningly sparkling in the light, and not paying attention to the danger, only feeling how his heart was breaking with anxiety. The girl, barely holding back her tears, could not hold back when Tybalt, standing in front of her, began to sincerely apologize, expressing his deep concern and sympathy, and his words, filled with regret, touched her to the depths of her soul. Getting down on one knee, looking down at the ground, he promised her that now, no matter what, he would always be there, ready to support and protect, and his vow was sincere and full of determination, and it seemed that this moment changed their relationship forever. The weapons had been thrown to the ground, to the side away, and now they lay as if forgotten, having lost their power and meaning in this foggy silence that surrounded them, creating the feeling that everything that had happened before no longer mattered. Outside the window, it was raining, trickling down the glass in small streams, creating a sound reminiscent of the warm whisper of nature, and inside it was warm and cozy. The room was filled with soft light, filling the space with an atmosphere of peace and safety, as if time had slowed down here. The hand carefully took the saucer on which stood a cup of hot tea, and without saying a word, the guy served the drink to his lady, offering her to warm up and not get sick, carefully monitoring her condition. Juliet sat wrapped tightly in a soft blanket, trying to protect herself from the cold. Her gaze was directed into emptiness, and she seemed fragile, vulnerable, but in her heart there still grew gratitude for the care she felt at that moment. The aristocrat could not find peace. Her thoughts were overwhelmed with anxiety, and she asked Tybalt again and again if he had remembered everything. Her voice, filled with anxiety, did not hide the feeling that something important was still escaping her attention, remaining unnoticed. Tybalt, sitting calmly in a chair and leisurely enjoying his tea, confidently replied that he remembered everything perfectly down to the smallest detail, and his words sounded with unshakable confidence that he had not forgotten a single important moment of their past. As the beauty suddenly ordered her swordsman to come to her and sit down next to her on the bed, her gaze was calm but demanding, as if she expected support and closeness at that moment. The man obediently followed the order, sat down next to her, and feeling his presence, Juliet instantly felt her shoulder enveloped in tender care, and her heart filled with warmth, as if his support had become a pillar of strength for her at that moment. With a heavy sigh, the noblewoman felt relieved that she could finally return to her world, and that the swordsman had become the very hope that opened the way for her back to the familiar reality where she could be herself. Tybalt, who was surprised by her story and wanted to know more insistently, asked her to explain where she came from, and was amazed to hear about a modern world where you can control water through a tap and fire with a stove, just like in a fairy tale. The lady burst out laughing at Tybalt's suggestion that she came from a world ruled by witches, her laughter filling the room with a living light, and her eyes sparkled with mirth, as if she couldn't believe that anyone could mistake her for a sorceress. Sitting next to the man, sweet Juliet suddenly realized that she might have been emotionally dependent on him, and this discovery made her heart beat a little faster, as if in this simple moment there was a whole universe of feelings. A light smoke rose from the cup of tea standing on the table, slowly curling in the air and filling the space around with warmth. The fragrant steam created an atmosphere of comfort and peace, as if time in this place slowed down and the whole world for a moment focused only on them. The hand of the lovely Juliet picked up the papers from the floor. Her movements were cautious but decisive, and meeting the man's gaze, they both understood without words that they were ready to try again, despite all the trials, and were striving for their happy ending. Tybalt himself nervously asked the lady if she would like to finally stop leaning on him and move away. A little, his words were full of uncertainty, and he seemed to expect that her answer would help dispel his doubts. The lady refused. Her gaze was calm, but at some point she suddenly asked a strange question that made Tybalt freeze. Perhaps she should stop trying to get closer to Romeo and not strive to marry him. The beauty sat down, tucking her legs under her, and hesitantly clasped them with her arms, feeling her heart beat faster from excitement. There was something uncertain in her gaze which made her even more attractive at that moment. Juliet considered whether the best way out might be to accept the current circumstances and let go of everything that was connected with her dreams of marriage with Romeo. However, her heart violently protested against this thought, telling her that such a decision was simply impossible. The man, shocked by the lady's words that she could leave everything behind and stay with him, could hardly believe what he heard. The man's thoughts were full of confusion and surprise, because such a turn of events seemed incredible to him. The noblewoman, noticing his reaction, smiled kindly and asked him with interest to share his opinion on everything that had been said, expecting to hear his point of view, which could shed light on her doubts. Brave Tybalt stood next to him, his hand clenched tightly into a fist, feeling the tension building in his chest. His bold gaze was full of determination and anger, because he could not calmly watch what was happening. He could not even imagine that Juliet herself would suddenly ask him to stay with her and spend their whole lives together without any conditions or doubts. He simply could not put this thought off in his mind because it was so unexpected and exciting. But as soon as he realized the seriousness of the woman's words, something strange suddenly happened. The noblewoman laughed loudly and admitted that all this time she had simply been joking with him, playing with his feelings and violating all logic in this situation.